This story of reincarnation began at the very moment when humanity finally achieved victory. However, our protagonist was deep in thought about the price that had to be paid for this victory. The battle was fought against 6 great demons who sought to destroy the world, but the heroes managed to crush them all to the last one. However, the price was horrific. The sea of death left by this god swallowed up most of the land, including cities and entire civilizations. Thus, with this victory, humanity itself found itself on the brink of extinction. And then the hero even cursed, looking at the scale of the losses. He wondered about the meaning of this victory, which in reality felt like a defeat, since all around him there was only endless ruins. Not a single surviving hero remained alive, and even the Tower of Heroes, once a symbol of Earth's resilience, collapsed and turned into rubble. Then Chris looked with bitterness at the destroyed sea, which did not disappear even after the death of its creator. However, at that moment, he was interrupted by a mocking voice accusing him of creating a senseless drama. The speaker turned out to be Sam, Mad Dog, and he mockingly remarked that if anyone saw him now, they would think that this was his doing. Luisa Valente, known as Wild Dog, added that he was acting like a child, pretending to be injured and now acting tough. Amir Singh, nicknamed the Ice Dog, added that their leader was in fact just an opportunist who wanted to take all the credit for himself. However, the last blacksmith, Chris, soon answered them, reminding them that without the equipment he had created, they would not have lasted even a minute. His words irritated his 3 interlocutors, who looked at him with obvious displeasure. And then Chris ordered them to be quiet. These 3 were known as the 3 Dogs. They never took the side of either humanity or the side of demons. They acted solely on their own whim, pursuing personal interests. In other words, they were a group of selfish opportunists. However, it was they who managed to survive until the end, and their contribution to the final battle turned out to be the greatest. The protagonists then pondered their fate, wondering if the outcome would have changed if the 3 had offered their power earlier. After this, the young man asked them a direct question about whether any of them would survive this battle. Sam was the first to respond, admitting that his internal organs were completely destroyed and the end was near. Louise said that she was under a curse that prevented her from stopping the bleeding, while Amir added that his heart was pierced. Then the hero looked at them with reproach and sadness, explaining that this was retribution for their hesitation and delay in helping. He scolded them for the selfishness they retained until their last breath, thinking only of themselves. And suddenly all 3 of them collapsed before him, lifeless bodies having breathed their last. Chris sighed heavily as he looked at them, admitting that they had remained a burden and a source of irritation until the very end. After this, the young man, treading heavily, began to collect their weapons from the ground. With a bloody hand, he took out his hammer to forge something for his comrades one last time. Readying himself, he raised the tool over one of the blades. He then fixed it one last time and thrust it into the ground, asking them to take care of the weapon this time. Chris thought that at least it would be a worthy tombstone for the warriors. Meanwhile, he was left alone in front of a giant wave approaching him. Now he finally began to wonder if it was time for him to go. In his final moments, the protagonist decided that this would be the last time he would do something like that. Suddenly, he put his hand on his chest. Suddenly, sparks flashed between his fingers, after which a window appeared in front of him, informing him that the extraction of fate from Chris's target had begun. The energy condensed and formed a shining diamond crystal in his hand. After this, another message appeared, indicating that the connection with Chris's creator had reached a certain level. It was his unique ability, link extraction, an innate skill that allowed him, as a link forger, to extract special ores from targets. However, he knew that using this ability on himself would not yield anything valuable, only something worse than ordinary iron ore. Then he looked thoughtfully at the stone in his hand and decided that if there was nothing in it, then at least let him take regret with him. After this, the hero raised his hammer high, deciding to use it to forge the final weapon. At that moment, the roar of the waves rang in his ears, and he wondered if it was the sound of the sea being destroyed or the sound of the waves that he had heard all his life. However, he was sure of one thing. Every time that sound rang in his ears, his hands created instruments that went beyond imagination. Then Chris hit the stone with his hammer as hard as he could, and a bright light flashed, filling everything around. When the glow dissipated, he saw that the stone had turned into a small dagger, and then the young man smiled ironically. Despite his hopes of receiving something exceptional, he held up the ordinary dagger, expressing disappointment at its utter simplicity. In the end, the hero decided to commit suicide with his own hands rather than drown in the waves of the cursed sea. As he sank into the depths, he laughed at himself, calling it madness, because the last act of his life was a blow with a hammer. And only in the last moments, the young man, while creating this dagger, realized the truth. The sound of the waves he had heard since the awakening of his power was actually the sound of the Sea of Doom. A feeling of regret washed over him, and he wondered what would have happened if he had realized this earlier or had managed to convince the three dogs to join them. If I had used my hammer to help others even a little, perhaps many things would have turned out differently. And suddenly a window appeared in front of him, informing him about the manifestation of the equipment image, and then the skill, Return to the Origins, was activated. He suddenly found himself in a brightly lit place, and at that moment a voice was heard calling out to Chris and reminding him about the exam. Chris hadn't heard the word student in 31 years, so the mention of an exam struck him as a shock, and the protagonist quickly put the pieces together. If we were talking about events 31 years ago, then he was at the entrance exam to the Tower of Babylon. Chris suddenly remembered the system window in which that dagger was displayed, and realized that this was the very embodiment of the image before death. Chris wondered if the return to the source was really due to the dagger, but soon received a warning from the observer. He threatened to expel the student if he didn't take the exam seriously, and Chris absent-mindedly confirmed that he understood. He then looked at the hammer in his hand and muttered quietly, finally realizing the reality of his time travel. The young man then began to wonder if he could change everything if he realized his abilities earlier and started using the hammer. However, almost immediately he pushed this thought away and gripped the instrument tightly, realizing that there was something more important. Now Chris clearly realized that only one thing mattered: the need to take advantage of the opportunity given to him. Then Chris made a promise to himself that in this life he would definitely enter the Tower of Babylon at any cost. The meeting with the three dogs was supposed to be the starting point on the way to the goal. With these thoughts, the hero grabbed the hammer and began to work with such seriousness that he attracted the attention of the observer. He thought about the personality of this interesting student. His blacksmithing skills were astonishing. Although the blows seemed slow, they were rhythmic and precise, producing a clear sound. As a result, the observer came to the conclusion that the level of blacksmithing skill of this young man was extremely high. Meanwhile, Chris's work amazed the other students, who began to guess what level of skill he had achieved. When the young man held the perfectly polished and flawless blade in his hands, the assistant could not believe his eyes. The young man decided that a truly outstanding student had come to the exam this year. At the same time, the observer himself was confident that if he submitted the work in this form, he would immediately pass the test. However, he was then surprised to see Chris raise his hammer high into the air, intending to shatter the newly forged blade. The next moment, the blade shattered into pieces, leaving the observer and his assistant in complete shock. The hero himself understood how far he was from perfection. Moreover, he believed that it would be unacceptable for a real blacksmith to imagine such work. At this moment, Assistant Han shouted loudly, declaring that destroying a weapon in front of the master was a mockery of the exam. However, Chris ignored him and addressed the observer directly, saying that he wanted to reforge the quest from the very beginning. The assistant tried to intervene again, but the observer calmly interrupted him. He ordered him to bring the remaining materials for the student, which caused obvious surprise in Khan. Throwing a stern look at the assistant, the man asked whether he had broken the rules or whether he should go get the materials himself. The angry assistant answered negatively and hastened to carry out the order. Meanwhile, the observer turned the conversation to the young man and reminded him that there were only 40 minutes left until the end of the exam. The hero confirmed that he knew about it. The observer then asked him if he still thought it was the right decision to split his work. At first, the hero thought, looking at the fragments of the weapon he had created. However, Chris firmly replied that he could not deliver a product of that level. Hearing this, the observer smiled approvingly and advised him to do his best. However, the protagonist realized that achieving perfect blacksmithing skills with his current body would be extremely difficult. He lacked mana, strength, and even time. Therefore, he had to choose the optimal path. And suddenly, one of the students heard a strange sound coming from Chris. He noticed him pouring mana into the kindling stone and exclaimed, warning him that the stone would explode when ignited. However, the hero did not pay any attention to the warning. Instead, he split the pieces of stone and threw them straight into the fire, causing panic among the disciples who thought he had gone mad. The next moment, a flame burst from his forge, shimmering with a multitude of colors. Chaos broke out in the workshop and the students started shouting for a fire extinguisher. Assistant Han rushed towards the observer, but the latter calmly stopped him, noting that he should not give in to panic. He then ordered his assistant to watch the flame stream carefully, although he looked confused by this instruction. It was the 5-color fire demon technique, a high-temperature flame enhanced by the resonance of 5 kindling stones. Although this technique required extremely precise control of mana, it was considered an effective method. It allowed one to work even with minimal reserves, and Chris mastered it to perfection. The rest of the students were stunned, not understanding why the forge had not yet exploded, but soon noticed something even stranger. Under the influence of the multicolored flame, the color of the iron alloy itself began to change. Then the observer realized Chris's plan. He had synchronized the kindling stones to increase the heat and change the properties of the metal. Ultimately, the observer concluded that this method would significantly reduce forging time, but he still remained skeptical. There were only 30 minutes left until the end of the exam, and time was still running out. Although the student's previous work was excellent, the observer felt that it was not enough to complete everything on time. However, Chris continued to work with full concentration. Ignoring the doubts of those around him, he struck the hot metal, forming a blade. He forged it right in the multicolored flame. Chris has been keeping a close eye on the process to make sure everything is done correctly, and so far everything has gone according to plan. Then he continued to strike the blade with the hammer. Suddenly, the protective layer disappeared from his hand as his mana supply ran out. This disappointed Chris, making him feel weak in his own body. Then the main character decided that he would start training immediately after the end of the test. However, he did not allow himself to waste a second. He continued to strike with the hammer with all his might, pushing his body to the limit to finish the job. Meanwhile, time was flying by. At first, there were 10 minutes left, then 3, and then only 1 minute. At the very last moment, the young man finished polishing the blade, just as the end of the exam was announced. He was breathing heavily from fatigue, and his arms were buzzing from overexertion. And then a message appeared in front of him about the completion of the creation of the blade of 5-colored fire, as well as about obtaining the skill of the Flame Master. The results showed that the sword's rank was high, and it was a blade engraved with 5 flames that interacted with mana. The other students couldn't believe what they were hearing, and one of them, in shock, asked again if the weapon's rank was really high. Chris then suggested that Assistant Han check the information window to confirm the details, which amazed him even more. At that moment, the assistant screamed loudly in shock. However, the observer immediately reprimanded him for shouting, after which he sheepishly apologized. Later, already in Professor Charles's office, the observer met with the main character. He asked him if he considered the sword worthy of surrender this time. Chris answered with some doubt, "For now." And then Charles noticed that the young man was still not entirely satisfied with his job. Then the man decided to talk to him frankly. He said that this place would not be able to fully reveal his talent, advising him to withdraw his application. He explained that the Tower of Babylon had a great reputation, but the forging department had not achieved significant results for a long time. This was information that the hero already knew. Chris knew from the future that in 8 years this department would close due to a decline in levels. In the future, the best educational institution for blacksmithing will be the Vulcan Academy. However, the young man interrupted the observer's thoughts, who was just about to mention Vulcan, and declared that he was mistaken. Then the hero said with complete confidence that it would not be Vulcan that would be the best, but Babylon, because it was he who would study there. The professor added that in that case he would first need to guarantee first place in the faculty and asked if he was confident in his abilities. The protagonist answered affirmatively that, of course, he was confident, explaining that there was no one stronger than him among the students. After this, the professor asked if he knew the process for selecting the best first-year student at Babylon Academy. Chris replied that he knew that the top 2 students in each specialization take an additional exam to determine one candidate. Then, from among all these candidates, the best first-year student in the entire department is selected. The Babylon Academy is generally divided into 3 main areas: combat, support, and technical. Each of them includes dozens of specializations intertwined with each other like roots. As for the title of Best Freshman, it is awarded to the person who receives significantly higher marks in all of these areas. After this, the professor decided to tell him one last thing, no longer as a teacher, but as a more experienced blacksmith. He said that even if he took first place in the department, it would still be extremely difficult for him to succeed here as a blacksmith. Charles advised the hero to enroll in the Vulcan Academy, emphasizing that this was the best path for his future. Chris smiled slightly, realizing that the professor put the student's future above his own position and recognized him as a worthy person. However, the hero replied that the environment did not matter. As he already said, the Babylon he will enter will soon become the best. The professor chuckled quietly, wondering to himself if he would be the best wherever he went. This statement went beyond ordinary confidence and bordered on pure self-assurance. After that, he extended his hand for a handshake. Charles said with a smile that he would be very happy to work side by side with him. Chris shook it enthusiastically, also noting that he was looking forward to cooperation. And at that moment, a message appeared in front of him about the creation of a connection with Charles, and that the level of connection with the Creator had reached level 1. The hero then immediately took advantage of the opportunity and used the connection extraction on Charles. A unique piece of metal, iron imbued with fire, appeared in his hand. It was a high-grade material, possessing the properties of wood and capable of containing flame. Later, already in his room, the young man checked his characteristics and reflected on what had happened. The piece of metal he received was not bad, but its size turned out to be extremely small. Then Chris thought about his ability to extract destiny. It was a skill that reflected his connection to the target and allowed him to extract minerals that did not previously exist. However, the problem was that the connection level was too low to fully utilize this ability. Furthermore, his stats were still extremely weak compared to other Babylon freshmen. Chris sighed heavily, realizing that the situation was not going well, but he considered it the price to pay for returning to the past. Then the young man decided to take his time, realizing that expecting more now would be greedy. Besides, he still had enough time to destroy the scum of Pandemonium, the creatures that threatened the entire planet. Even the 6 great demon gods who brought humanity to the brink of extinction were part of their plan. Ultimately, Chris came to the conclusion that in order to stop them, he must not hesitate and must use any means necessary. At the same time, he realized that he could not risk his memories of key future events, which could fade over time. Although his goal was already clear, Chris knew that the first step of the plan, entering Babylon Academy, was already complete. Then the hero suddenly saw a notification. Chris's connection level reached level 1, and he had a new skill: Fate's Imprint. A week later, Creech was already at Babylon Academy. At this time, the young man wondered if he was lost again. But soon he finally found the right place, smelting shop number 3. However, as soon as he opened the door to greet those present, someone abruptly interrupted him, addressing him by his full name. As Chris entered, he noticed that his exam opponent was already there. The fair-haired man looked at him with obvious displeasure and noted that he looked too relaxed. It turned out to be Michael Barmut, the vice dean of Borsippa, who scolded him, wondering if he couldn't see that everyone was already waiting for him. However, Professor Charles calmly reminded him that there were still 10 minutes left before the start of the additional exam. However, the deputy dean sharply objected, stating that the issue was not about time, but about behavior. Then Chris realized that the forging department was not just experiencing difficulties, but that the professor himself was in conflict with senior management. Only now did the young man realize the true reason why he had advised him to choose another academy. After this, Chris tried to greet another person. The blonde man sitting next to him looked at him attentively, but not at all kindly. When Chris tried to speak to him, his words were suddenly cut off as he silently turned his face away. This caused confusion in the hero, since no one had treated him like that for a long time. At that moment, the door opened again and a girl came inside, asking if everyone was already there. The main character and the blonde man standing next to him immediately noticed her. Michael Barmouth greeted her as the dean and remarked that he had been wondering when she would arrive. However, Chris's surprise turned out to be much stronger. The thing is, he recognized this woman. It was Rebecca, the dean of Borsippa Academy of Babylon. The woman took her seat and apologized for being late. At this moment, the young man experienced a real shock and wondered why she was here. He knew she had worked in Babylon for some time. However, Chris never expected that she would become the dean. Rebecca was an S-rank hero known as a weapon eater. She possessed a unique skill that allowed her to enhance her strength by absorbing weapons. In a past life, she was his regular client, with whom he collaborated for a long time. However, the most vivid memory of her for the hero remained one tragic scene in the rain. At this point, Rebecca was on the verge of death and regretfully admitted that she had absorbed his weapon. This painful memory was still imprinted in his mind. Chris was so deeply immersed in it that he didn't even notice what was happening. However, Professor Charles's voice brought him back to reality. When he called out his name, Chris responded in confusion. The professor then announced that he would now begin to explain the details of the exam, asking everyone to listen carefully. Charles first clarified that the total test time was 90 minutes. During this time, the participants had to create a weapon that could be used in conjunction with the sword from the previous exam. However, the professor then added a condition. The equipment must be forged exclusively using alchemical forging. He then pointed to a pile of different ores. The man said that participants have complete freedom in choosing materials. He explained that the weapons would be assessed by Dean Rebecca and Vice Dean Barmouth, and urged them to make every effort. After this, he announced with a gesture the beginning of the exam. Then Chris and his rival got ready to get to work. At this moment, the protagonist looked at his apron, pondering the alchemical forging technique imposed in this test. He needs to use pure mana to create resonance with the elemental mana to prevent it from going out of control. And then his opponent mockingly asked if his mana reserves would increase if he continued to simply look at the materials. Chris then turned to him and asked if he was talking to him. In response, he sarcastically asked if he saw anyone else there. However, Professor Charles intervened and addressed him by name, calling him Hans Barmouth. He warned him to refrain from making any comments that were not related to the exam. The hero then quickly matched the name of Vice Dean Michael Barmouth with the name of his opponent. And then Chris realized that this arrogant young man was actually the son of the Vice Dean, which explained their obvious resemblance. Hans noticed Chris's look and condescendingly confirmed that he was the son of the Vice Dean, clearly proud of his origins. He considered Chris to be a commoner with the worst bloodline, ranking last among the first years in terms of mana reserves. At the same time, he himself belonged to the prestigious Barmouth family, famous in the field of alchemical forging. Hans was confident that his mana reserves were comparable to the best second-year students. After this, Hans confidently raised the blue crystal and declared that the result of the exam had already been decided in his favor. Meanwhile, Rebecca observed the materials and noted that they were gemstones with high mana content and the water attribute. Charles then explained that water mana was sensitive to fire, making it extremely difficult to forge. However, Michael smiled confidently, noting that such difficulties were a thing of the past. In response, the professor added that the processing time varies depending on the master and the ore, and in this situation, it is about 30 minutes. The deputy dean smugly declared that Hans could process any ore in just 30 minutes. After this, his son began to channel mana to the blue stones, causing them to float within glowing magical circles. This caused general amazement with his ability to complete the resonant processing in record time. Completing resonant synthesis in 30 minutes is a level that surpasses even second-year students, not to mention first-year students. Charles realized that the tight deadlines for forging mana stones, the abundance of materials, and the use of alchemical forging played into their hands. Then the professor cast an angry glance at the deputy dean, realizing that the exam topic had been chosen in Hans's favor from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Chris caught the dean's attention by surprising her with his choice. He held in his hands a transparent crystal and several red stones. The judges looked at the materials he chose, wondering why he used stones with a strong fire attribute. However, the Vice Dean concluded that Chris simply did not understand the limits of his abilities, although he had excessive pride. Hans glanced at his opponent and wondered with a sneer whether he had deliberately chosen materials that were the opposite of his own. He called Chris a fool, being sure that such a weak reserve of mana would not allow him to control such unstable firestones. Then Hans smiled smugly, expecting to win this test even more easily than he had imagined. However, he was suddenly hit by his opponent's skill, and windows appeared around Chris, informing him that the skill seal of fate had been activated. The system revealed that his fire affinity had been activated, allowing him to directly place and use affinity stones on his body. Then a message appeared on the screen about equipping the fire iron to Chris's right hand. His palm instantly burst into a thick flame, the fire thickening around his hand, causing Hans to be shocked. He was seething with anger, considering what was happening to be cheap and useless tricks. Ignoring his opponent's gaze, the protagonist began to direct fire around his hand. He then picked up the chosen materials, the clear stone and the 3 red ones, and made them float in the center of the flame. The stones rotated and interacted in harmony within the dense ring of fire he created. Meanwhile, Michael mockingly wondered if Chris was going to create resonance using the same metal attribute. He called him a fool, reminding himself that the main rule in this area was to use only pure mana. The deputy dean was certain that such an attempt would inevitably lead to the elemental mana getting out of control. He even waited with an evil smile for the moment when this fool would cause a catastrophe. However, Chris continued to concentrate on controlling the flames that enveloped his hand. And suddenly there was a powerful surge of mana, causing Hans to flinch from the force of the fire emanating from the hero's side. Even the judges were forced to cover their eyes due to the brightness of the flash. Meanwhile, inside the fireball, the materials melted and merged smoothly, gradually taking the shape of a sword sheath. Meanwhile, Chris himself breathed a sigh of relief. He then saw reports of the removal of the fire iron and the successful completion of the creation of the item, the flame accumulator scabbard. Rebecca, Charles, and Michael were completely amazed to see such an unexpected result. The evaluation screen showed that the scabbard was of rare rank and was imbued with fire mana, allowing the use of the wild flame skill. Hans, shocked to the core, shuddered, not believing that his opponent could complete the fusion process so quickly. He looked at his hands, covered in blue mana, convincing himself that the elemental mana must be going out of control. While he was doubting himself and trying to figure out if he had made a mistake in his calculations, he decided to complete the fusion of his stone. However, suddenly the stone began to crack in his hands, warning of an impending disaster. Hans realized his mistake too late and tried to stop it, but the crack only widened, releasing powerful energy. The next moment, the stone exploded with destructive force. A deafening roar echoed throughout the examination hall. At this moment, silence reigned in the examination hall of the forging department after the incident that had occurred. Shards of shattered blue stones were scattered across the floor. Hans stood with his head down, and defeat was written on his face. Then Professor Charles finally broke the silence. He explained that typically, after completing the assessment, one of the participants would be recommended as a candidate for admission to an undergraduate program. He then looked at the fallen youth and expressed regret at his defeat. He clarified that Hans was being withdrawn from the exam because he had failed to complete the task. Charles added that it was very bad. It was an absolute defeat. However, Michael suggested canceling the exam and rerunning it, citing the fact that the student had been injured during the assessment. However, Charles refused to cancel the exam that had already been held, since what had happened was a direct result of Hans's carelessness. In response, the deputy dean gave him a cold look and accused him of putting exam results above student safety. His words caused the professor's obvious displeasure. The deputy dean rose abruptly from his seat and walked towards Chris. He stated that the fastest resonance speed officially recorded at the academy was a full 5 minutes. Michael wondered how a student who had just entered the academy had achieved resonance the very moment he activated mana. Chris returned to the essence of alchemical forging, a technique for creating weapons using only mana when traditional methods fail. The hero then realized that the purpose of alchemical forging was to find the roots of the ore's heart and reveal its hidden nature. What he just demonstrated is a solution that blacksmithing academies will arrive at after much trial and error. This simple method will become the basic standard in a few years, and therefore is not a secret. However, there was no point in explaining something like this to a man who was only used to making threats, and he replied that he did not understand what was being discussed. Then Mike smiled slyly and directly accused Chris of using dirty tricks to achieve his goal. He based his accusation on the fact that it was impossible for a first-year student without belonging to an influential family to be able to create a rare rank weapon. He added that even if he had decided to cheat, he should have done it more believably. But Chris was amazed at such audacity. However, at this point, Dean Rebecca intervened, noting that the situation really did seem illogical. Michael decided that she agreed with him and smiled contentedly, suggesting that Chris be expelled immediately and a re-examination scheduled. However, his smile quickly disappeared and was replaced by bewilderment when the girl ignored his words and walked past. Instead, she headed towards the table where the scabbard Chris had crafted lay. Rebecca picked up the item and began to examine it carefully, a look of shock gradually appearing on her face. She muttered quietly that she could hardly believe what she saw. Then, quite unexpectedly, she turned to Chris. Rebecca, her eyes shining, insistently asked to be allowed to taste the weapon or at least lick it once. The dean's reaction shocked both the deputy dean and the professor, and a strange silence fell over the room. Later that day, Chris walked through the busy streets of the city. Along the way, the protagonist went over the details of the scabbard he had created in his head, objectively assessing his work. He concluded that the overall finish of the piece was good, but the fine-tuning still left much to be desired. Still, Chris couldn't help but smile as he remembered how the vice dean had literally trembled with rage. Passers-by even noticed his restrained laughter, considering his behavior strange. Chris suddenly stopped as an unexpected thought flashed through his mind. He realized that the name Barmut seemed familiar to him. Then the hero closed his eyes, trying to concentrate and activate his memory to remember where he had already heard this name. Soon, his memories brought him back to a conversation with Louise, that during her studies at the Babylon Academy, she acquired a weapon. She got it at a good price after working hard for an arrogant man, but the weapon suddenly exploded. The explosion caused severe mana burns, leaving her in a terrible state. Putting all the pieces together, Chris concluded that the blacksmith who had caused Louise this injury had the surname Barmouth, and then he wondered if this man was Hans Barmouth. Then Chris remembered his goal: to establish contact with the so-called three dogs as quickly as possible and guide them on a more correct path. However, he now realized that in Louise's case, he might not even have to put in much effort. Chris was convinced that simply by keeping Hans Barmouth under control, he could prevent her destiny from going astray. Meanwhile, in the Borsippa department's faculty meeting room, Michael protested the proposal to nominate Chris as the top student. Professors from other fields expressed concern and doubts about such a sudden decision. Rebecca then asked if they were against her decision. One of the teachers hastened to soften his position. However, the vice dean intervened again, stating that their concern was due to the fact that the dean had only recently taken up his position. Rebecca glanced at him sideways as he continued speaking. Michael admitted that the weapon Chris had created was indeed impressive, but he needed a more thorough and careful evaluation. Charles intervened and made his point, noting that the others had not seen how the student worked with the materials. He emphasized that the way mana is used and the level of compatibility with the five-color system deserve special attention. Then the dean interrupted them, explaining that the weapon might not have even reached 60% of the level Chris was aiming for. However, it is precisely this shortcoming that makes the result so promising and serves as proof of its enormous potential. Rebecca stated that if they continued to reject her decision even after seeing Chris's presentation, she would resign as dean. The announcement, which sounded like a clap of thunder, caused amazement among everyone present in the meeting hall. 54 years ago, the heavens granted humanity the Tower of Heroes to guide its evolution. But in response, the underworld unleashed pandemonium. This swamp, distorting all forms of life, opened up new opportunities for people, but doomed them to great disaster. From the very womb of this chaos, Babylon was born, the greatest academy that raised many heroes called to protect humanity. The reigning emperor, Ludwig Schubert, claimed that each of the students would become the very hero who would carry the banner of peace. The ruler then called on them to move forward. This burden falls on the shoulders of everyone who rose up and joined Babylon, and that it is their inevitable duty as future heroes. Chris watched him silently, thinking that from this point of view he seemed like a good person. However, from previous experience he knew that in reality this was not entirely true. After the performance, the host announced the beginning of the demonstration performances of this year's best first-year students. He then asked the top students from each house to come into the arena, and Chris, along with the other candidates, headed towards the site. The hero recalled how, in his past life, he had not understood the reasons for the arrogance of these excellent students, which had manifested itself only because of their success at the academy. Then the host officially announced the start of the performances. And now, having found himself in their shoes through his own achievements, Chris realized what a feeling such a position gives. With great enthusiasm, the presenter presented to the audience the target that would be used to test the students' abilities. It turned out to be a high-tech robot of the 9th model, known as Automaton, a golem created in a puppet factory. He had high combat effectiveness, enough to compete with a C-rank hero on equal terms. Chris carefully examined the mechanism and came to the conclusion that this model, having no weapons, relied on direct physical contact. The demonstration was opened by the combat faculty. Jake Myers was declared the best freshman in the Ackerkoof department, so he was invited to step forward. Jake took a position in the arena opposite the robot, while the hero remembered that he was the third son of the Myers family. He was known for practicing an unusual form of fistfighting despite coming from a line of swordmasters. Meanwhile, Jake assumed a fighting stance, preparing for a collision, while the robot's eyes glowed red. At that very moment, the host announced the start of the long-awaited duel. The robot rushed towards the enemy with lightning speed. He tried to immediately deliver a powerful blow to him, but the young man dodged it with amazing flexibility. What followed was a series of exchanges of blows and quick maneuvers on both sides, accompanied by dodges of attacks. At some point, Jake finally caught the right moment. The guy said with a confident smile that it was now his turn to attack. He rushed forward, concentrating all his strength into one blow. His fist, filled with energy, crashed down on his opponent. Jake collided with the robot's sturdy structure with tremendous force, sending it flying backwards. It created a powerful shockwave throughout the arena, causing debris to fly in all directions. Chris looked at what was happening in amazement, remembering that in his past life, this young man had died at the age of about 20 years old. Jake continued his series of crushing blows, and the hero realized that such talent appeared in Babylon only once a decade. He pondered the reason why someone with such outstanding abilities had not been able to surpass rank A in his previous life. Soon, Jake landed lightly and gracefully, signaling that the fight was over. Pieces of the destroyed robot rolled across the arena as it was completely destroyed. When the robot's head fell to the floor, everyone realized that the fight had ended in a crushing victory for the student. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with a satisfied smile, saying that it had been a long time since he had been able to stretch so well. Meanwhile, the presenter looked at him in complete amazement at what he saw. He then praised the student for being able to defeat an opponent with the strength of a C-rank hero in just a few moments. The presenter confirmed that this level of performance is exactly what is expected from the best first-year student of the Akarku faculty. Chris realized that Jake had given up on the gift from the very beginning, and now the next contestant would have to face serious pressure. Soon, the host invited the best student of the Faculty of Support student Erika Inoue, to come forward. Erika was the eldest daughter of the Inoue family, one of the 3 great noble houses of Japan. In her past life, she didn't conquer the tower, but she managed to become famous as an S-rank hero who wielded legendary-level weapons. However, her destiny was to fall, become a demon, and ultimately die by execution at the hands of her own family. However, as the girl passed by, Erika glanced at Chris. This look confused the hero, and he wondered if it was really addressed specifically to him. The presenter then announced that the 9th model automaton would be used for its demonstration. It was equipped with additional armor, which increased its protective strength by 1.5 times compared to the standard version. Everyone watched the proceedings with excitement, waiting to see what kind of performance Erika would give. With complete composure, Erika opened the cage she had brought with her and revealed the black raven inside. Then, as her eyes glowed blue, the girl gave a mental command to the bird to attack. The raven immediately flew out of the cage and rushed towards the enemy. He soared into the arena sky with a sharp cry. Meanwhile, Chris watched this with surprise, wondering why they would use a bird in such a battle. The automaton assumed a tight defensive stance. The protagonist came to the conclusion that it would be extremely difficult to penetrate such strong armor. Moreover, this model was originally designed for protection. However, suddenly blue magical circles began to form around the raven, gradually changing its shape and clad it in armor. Now the raven looked much more impressive. Then the bird quickly swooped down, heading towards the automaton. In the blink of an eye, the raven dealt a crushing blow to the enemy, who did not even have time to react. Chris was shocked to watch as the mechanism's durable armor cracked and crumbled under the weight of the attack. Soon everyone saw that there was a huge hole right through the robot's chest. The automaton fell to its knees, thus signifying its complete defeat. At the same time, the raven calmly returned and landed on the finger of Erika, who was standing in the center of the arena. The stands erupted in cries of amazement, and the presenter, amazed by what he saw, expressed admiration for her performance. Chris realized that this atmosphere could result in ridicule if he simply showed off his gear and left the stage. Finally, his turn came when the host announced the entry of the best first-year student of the Borsip engineering faculty, Chris. Ludwig noted that the level of students this year is outstanding. The blacksmithing department had not produced a top student for a long time, and he hoped the pressure would not be too great. In response, Rebecca confidently stated that he would be fine. Meanwhile, the audience wondered if this student could surpass the impressive performances of his predecessors. Chris stood in the center of the arena and slowly drew his sword from its sheath, showing off his weapon. It was a high-quality 5-color flame blade and a rare rank scabbard with elemental binding. Students noted that the weapon was of rare rank, but others noted that the weapon's appearance seemed quite ordinary. This made Mike smile wickedly, deciding that luck was on his side. He was confident that Chris's failure to make a strong impression would ensure his succession to the post of Dean of Borsippa. At the same time, Rebecca gave him a sharp, irritated look, sensing his insidious intentions. Meanwhile, the host began to announce a Model 10 automaton, which had combat power comparable to a D-rank hero. However, Chris demanded a more powerful Model 8 automaton with additional armor to increase durability. This demand hit the presenter like a bolt from the blue. He didn't understand why the student was asking them to do this. Even the 8th model can withstand attacks from B-rank heroes, and adding extra armor to it is excessive. He tried to object, pointing out the difficulty of preparing such an automaton in a short time. However, before he could finish, he was interrupted by a man who confirmed that what was required had already been delivered. At that moment, Charles appeared, dragging an armored automaton of the 8th model into the arena. The presenter was shocked by the speed with which the seemingly impossible request was fulfilled. Meanwhile, the professor glanced at his student. The man wished him luck in the arena and encouraged him to have a blast. The presenter was still confused and fell silent for a moment. However, he then loudly announced the official start of the demonstration. The stands immediately exploded with shouts of anticipation of a spectacular battle. Chris stood confidently on the battlefield, wondering if he would live up to the expectations placed on him. The young man then slowly drew his sword, and 5 colors began to shine from the blade. With each passing second, the tongues of flame enveloping the weapon grew stronger. This caused amazement among some students who recognized the power of the weapon. However, Hans also noted with disdain that what he saw was nothing more than a useless visual effect. Meanwhile, Chris recalled the properties of his unique sword. The 5 colors that formed its blade had a contradictory nature. Any attempt to release them without full control over the mana will result in a powerful explosion that could cost the user their life. However, thanks to the sheath imbued with fiery energy, he was able to control the flames, thereby avoiding the consequences. By combining the flame of the scabbard with the power of the blade, Chris was able to successfully complete the energy implantation process. At the same time, the armored automaton was preparing for defense. The hero then released the wild flame skill hidden in his sheath. This resulted in the release of a huge explosion of compressed mana. This skill was activated at the moment when there were 5 compressed fire demons inside. Eventually, they all exploded simultaneously, generating a colossal destructive force. As a result, the entire hall shook from the powerful blow. The presenter, not believing his eyes, was shocked to think about who this mysterious young man was. At this time, Chris stood in the middle of a destroyed battlefield. He assessed the scale of the destruction caused. Looking at the huge crack cutting the arena in half, Chris wondered with an ironic smile if he had crossed the line. The presenter, shaking, shouted into the microphone, demanding that the support team immediately go to the main hall to fix the damage. He then announced the end of the demonstration performances of the best students. Later, at the dean's office, Rebecca walked inside and found Chris already waiting for her. The girl apologized for being late, explaining that she was busy cleaning the arena. However, the young man also apologized, expressing regret for having destroyed the main hall in such a way. He added that he should have been more careful, which surprised the dean, who asked why he was apologizing. Chris asked in amazement if she had called him to scold him for what had happened. However, Rebecca explained that the reason for the call was completely different. Then she froze in place, slightly embarrassed. Chris was also confused, wondering why she had called him. Then Rebecca finally gathered her courage and got to the point. After this, the girl made an unexpected offer, declaring that she was ready to pay a price 10 times higher than the market price. She asked him to sell her the 5-colored flame sword and the fire scabbard. Chris was surprised by this request, and at that moment a window appeared in front of him, informing him that an intimacy bond had been formed with Rebecca. At the same time, a new notification appeared confirming that the connection level between her and Chris had reached level 1. Chris realized that the connection had already been formed, unlike in his past life, when it required giving her a lot of weapons. Then the hero thanked the dean for this opportunity. Then he decided to immediately take advantage of it by using the fate extraction skill. A dense blue energy appeared around him, with which he extracted a special high-level connection from Rebecca. The energy condensed in his hand, forming a unique piece of metal. It was an advanced level material capable of absorbing iron. Meanwhile, the dean repeated her question about selling weapons, but Chris responded with a categorical refusal. This made her displeased, and she reminded him that he had already completed his task. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Charles informed the dean that the president had ordered the award ceremony to begin immediately. The man then asked permission to take student Chris with him. Rebecca only reluctantly nodded in agreement. Then Chris said he would see her later. After this, he left the office, leaving her alone, feeling very disappointed at the missed opportunity. Soon, he and Charles headed to the heart of the Babylon Academy, the old main building known as the Marduk Palace. Walking down the luxurious corridor, the professor advised him to behave politely in front of the president. He recalled that he had magnanimously ignored the incident with the destruction of the hall during the demonstration. Charles also stressed that the president is a figure on a completely different level. However, Chris calmly assured him that there was no need to worry about him. As the massive doors swung open, a solemn voice came from the far end of the hall and greeted him. It was the ruling emperor, President Ludwig, whom the hero remembered from his past life. This was the same hero who died in battle with the heavenly god of destruction, one of the 6 great demonic gods. Chris looked him over carefully and realized that he really did live up to the title of perfectionist. Ludwig noted that the weapon he demonstrated was interesting. However, he couldn't say that he didn't regret it at all, but he had high hopes for Chris. Although Chris was prepared for criticism, he still felt offended and even felt the urge to throw his creation into the nearest oven. As a reward for his talent and efforts, the president announced that he would give him 2 prizes. Chris considered the offer for a while. He then asked for rewards that could increase his magical power and improve his memory, which attracted the president's interest. However, he still fulfilled the student's request, and with a slight movement of his hand, summoned 2 unique artifacts. A box appeared in front of the hero, and these items were inside. The first was a heroic rank heavy dark inkstone. The second was a heroic rank dream tusk. Chris was amazed by what he saw. While the inkstone was rare, the dream tusk was almost impossible to find. A smile appeared on the hero's face. He realized that, despite the difficulty of using them, he already had an idea how to turn them to his advantage. Then Ludwig asked him if he liked these awards. Chris replied that they were perfect. After the hero left the hall, a mysterious entity that was next to the president addressed him. She wondered about the reason why this young man was given 2 rewards at once. Ludwig replied that he only did it because Chris had an indescribable ability to handle such objects. Then the other entity noticed that it felt as if it saw an old soul inhabiting a young body. In response, the president explained that this meant that the young man had the depth to make such an impression. Meanwhile, classes were already beginning at the academy. Sitting in the audience, Hans declined his friend's invitation to lunch. The blond man apologized and explained that he already had plans with Howard. His friend was stunned when he realized that he was talking about the best third-year student of the Borsippa faculty. Then Hans proudly noted that their families were close, and Howard himself allegedly wanted to meet with him to give advice on life at the academy. At that moment, when one of Hans's friends tried to join the cool students, Chris entered the auditorium. He took a quick look at his recent opponent and moved on to his seat. As the hero walked through the auditorium, everyone around him suddenly fell silent, and Hans cast a sharp, threatening glance at the young man. In response, Chris looked at him, his eyes glowing, emitting incredible killing intent. Hans couldn't stand the pressure and wondered in horror what was wrong with the guy's eyes. Eventually, the young man looked away as the hero walked past, thinking that his opponent had finally realized his true place. Hans clenched his fist, suppressing his anger and lamenting his defeat before the commoner. Meanwhile, Professor Charles entered the classroom and asked everyone to take their seats to begin the class. Having made sure that all the students were present, the teacher stood behind the podium. Charles announced that since this was the first lesson, they would begin with introductions. He then showed off a box filled with glowing alloys, explaining that the material was called projection alloy. The professor took one of the samples and explained that it was tens of times more sensitive to magical energy than ordinary ores. He then injected mana into it, and at that moment the alloy reacted to the energy and formed in his hand into a black sword surrounded by a fiery aura. Chris watched with admiration, realizing that it was this level of skill that had allowed Charles to enter the top 100 artisans in the world. The professor went on to explain that such high sensitivity makes it extremely difficult to use these alloys as real weapons. However, on the other hand, they reflect the unconscious traits of the master, allowing him to understand himself and reveal hidden sides. This is why weapons created from this material are called clones, and students' self-presentation will be replaced by the creation of such clones. He added that their work would be on display in the main building for a whole week and urged everyone to make every effort. Jake took the piece of alloy, and the hero thought about how its value exceeded 10 million won. After Hans gathered his energy, he formed a refined golden sword. However, Chris watched the proceedings with indifference, believing that none of these students possessed the most important talent. Finally, the professor called Chris to introduce himself. The young man then took his alloy, thinking that as the best student in the faculty, he should not hide his true strength. The next moment, powerful energy began to emanate from the alloy. Chris decided that since he had decided to participate, he intended to show everything he could. The next moment, a destructive wave swept through the audience and shook everyone present. A week later, the students gathered in the main building to see the clones on display. It was obvious that the reason for such a crowd of people was Chris's work. However, their surprise reached its peak when they read the explanatory plaque. It turned out that Chris's alloy had absorbed 19 other alloys during its formation, and the administration decided to leave the result as is. Some students tried to downplay the achievement, attributing it to chance or the use of multiple alloys. One student noted that the lack of outstanding students makes people believe this, but Erica disagreed. Moreover, Jake Myers supported her, and he himself carefully examined the work in front of him. He noted that even such a huge number of alloys turned out to be insufficient to fully express Chris's abilities. Meanwhile, in the blacksmith's workshop, one of the mentor's assistants was watching Chris work. He acted with astonishing precision, not allowing even a split-second error when striking his hammer. Khan was confused as to what he could possibly teach a student with such a level of skill. In the end, he decided to simply credit him for the task. After the rest of the students had completed their training, Han declared the class over. However, Chris remained where he was, continuing to work with concentration. The hero took the hammer, intending to continue processing the workpiece in his hands. But before he could strike, the mentor's assistant stopped him, wondering if he was going to destroy the product again. The mentor then reminded that this worksheet must be submitted after completing the current training stage. Chris was surprised by the word hand over, after which Han explained that Babylon provides financial support to students. He evaluates the effectiveness of the weapons they sell outside the academy, thereby providing a budget for their activities. The mentor then inquired about the reason for his dissatisfaction, suggesting that the problem might lie either in the body or in the level of mana. In response, Chris explained with a tired smile that at the moment the problem was in his body. He needs to smelt heavy rocks to create training tools, but he lacks the stamina to even try. Then the assistant mentor offered him an alternative. When it comes to forging, using magical enhancements will be more effective than physical training to increase strength. The idea intrigued Chris, and he smiled slightly to himself. This was a method he had avoided in his past life. However, now that his body is deprived of stamina, the hero realized that with the help of enhancements, he could smelt heavy materials. Chris thanked his mentor for the advice, but he dismissed it, saying it was nothing special. Then the hero decided to give a recommendation himself, explaining that he was using an excessive amount of mana when striking with his hammer. He should reduce its consumption to 70% and also concentrate the blows on one point. The young man then added that this approach would be more effective at the moment. His words left Khan in a state of shock, as he couldn't believe that a first-year student dared to give him advice. However, judging by the look he gave the hammer, he decided to test his words. At the Babylon Academy, students were encouraged to study independently and were allowed to attend classes from other departments. However, there were two main conditions. Firstly, the student had to successfully complete the core subjects in his or her specialty. Secondly, if he received 3 failing grades, he would be immediately expelled. Thus, freedom was granted, but along with it came responsibility for one's own choices. As Chris got off the train, he noticed Erika Inoue standing with several young men. One of them rudely interrupted him, demanding that he clear the way. The hero felt irritated by their behavior, believing that they should be the ones to give way. However, before the situation escalated, the girl turned to him. Erika asked where he was going. Chris replied that he was heading to the support department because he was considering taking a minor. Then Erika offered to be his guide, which shocked her friends. One of the young men tried to remind her of the upcoming meeting, but the girl made it clear that he could go without her. Despite this, the guy still insisted and reminded her that the elders were expecting her presence. And yet the girl replied that she was not interested. Chris just watched their squabble silently. Soon, the girl left the 2 annoying guys and went away with the main character. As they walked, Erika asked what kind of additional specialization he was looking for. Chris then explained that he wanted to study the enhancements. He needed enhancements that could enhance his physical abilities without interfering with the precise control required for forging. Erika suggested that he pay attention to the barriers, and the hero then wondered if they specialized exclusively in defense. However, Erika replied that it all depends on the method of application. To make her point, she created magic circles around the envelope she was holding. She then suggested that he try to tear it apart. Chris noticed that the strength of the envelope itself did not change, but the effect was different. The object retained its original properties, but became solid only when exposed to significant force. Then the hero came to the conclusion that such a technique was ideal for the forging process. Erika explained that to achieve this level of complex application, he would need the help of a teacher. The girl added that the barrier's teacher was married to one of her relatives, after which she offered to introduce him to him. However, the next moment, Chris suddenly realized something important. With a quick movement, he destroyed the magical chains holding the envelope, and Erika was shocked to the depths of her soul. She wondered to herself how he had managed to understand her family's barrier technique and destroy it in such a short time. Chris just smiled, acknowledging that barrier techniques were indeed worth considering, and thanked the girl for her advice. He then announced that he was going to enroll in classes and invited her to go and eat with the young men who were accompanying her. One of the young men ran up to Erica to make sure she was okay. However, the girl remained silent, lost in her thoughts, and handed him an envelope sealed with magic as a kind of test. But Erica never expected that he would be able to break the seal so easily. Later, at the Magic faculty, Chris walked next to Erica, their joint appearance arousing the curiosity of other students. They started whispering to each other, wondering why they were walking together. Some mentioned that they had seen them together during the demonstration. Chris noticed the rumor spreading, but only mocked people's excessive interest in other people's affairs. Deep down, the hero knew that if the girl really had any feelings for him, a connection would have already been established between them. When they entered the forest, Erica explained that it was a testing area for constructing barriers, which surprised the hero. As he moved further, the young man noticed other students who were desperately searching for something. Chris then wondered if this test was some kind of treasure hunt. Nevertheless, he continued to walk with the girl, considering everything that was happening to be a waste of time. Suddenly, the hero stopped, feeling the barrier, and kicking the ground, destroyed the illusion, revealing the forest and two assistants waiting for them. One of the assistants announced in surprise that he had passed the test, which left Chris confused. In the office of Professor Robert Perry of the Department of Barriers, Erica's interest in the best student of the Borsippa faculty was discussed. His assistant noted that he had previously been surprised why she had enrolled in the introductory course, but now everything became clear. As it turns out, Erica and Chris were spotted walking around campus together. The professor expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that because of her, the number of applications had doubled, although this did not make him happy at all. The fact is that at the special request of the young master of the Inoue family, an additional element was added to the test. It was a labyrinth of illusory spirits. This labyrinth was a basic barrier that distorted the senses and caused a person to become lost. Moreover, a person who does not possess knowledge of magic would not even be able to realize its existence. Despite Erica not providing any help, Chris managed to navigate the maze. He relied solely on instinct, which earned his assistant's admiration. After all the participants had completed the first test, the assistant announced that they would move on to the second stage. He then explained that based on the results of this test, students would be assigned to classes. One of the students volunteered to go first, seeing the challenge as an opportunity to get Erica's attention. The assistant explained that the second test was to destroy the barrier using only mana. The barrier was shaped like a web, with a spider made of mana in the center. The spider would constantly escape whenever he sensed mana through the threads, and as long as he remained unharmed, the web would endlessly regenerate. The first student encountered difficulties and tried to act in the traditional way, trying to cover the entire magical formula. However, the young man soon discovered that he lacked mana, so he decided to use speed to push the barrier. The student eventually managed to destroy it in 2 minutes and 23 seconds, but he did not focus on understanding the structure more deeply. The assistant noted that his performance could not be called bad, and the young man thanked him, although he himself felt ashamed in front of Eric. At the same time, many other students failed the test. The assistant then announced that all those who failed would begin their education in elementary school. Finally, he called Erica Inoue. The girl stepped forward and began the test with amazing calm and confidence. In an instant, she completely dismantled the barrier. This caused shock among everyone present, who could not believe her supernatural speed. At that moment, everyone clearly realized what it meant to be the best student in the faculty. Erica completed the test in 22 seconds. And although the mentor praised her result, he noted that the standard method of destruction would have allowed her to shave off another 2 seconds. Finally, it was Chris's turn, and the mentor looked at him carefully, assessing the young man to himself. He came to the conclusion that there was nothing special or outstanding about him. Chris knelt down in front of the magical web, determined to understand its nature, and began to study it carefully. This left students and mentors puzzled, wondering what he was doing and whether he realized the test had already begun. Chris, however, peered intently into the details of the barrier and came to the conclusion that it had properties similar to heavy rock ore. This ore has the ability to self-heal and return to its original state if there is not enough stimulation. Chris continued to sit motionless in front of the web, which further surprised the mentor, who was perplexed as to what he was doing. He was about to intervene to get his attention, but Erica stopped him. She said that the hero should be left alone and allowed to continue. At this point, Chris came up with the idea that if the barrier was like a heavy stone, it could hold the stimuli accumulated in it. Then he ran his hand, shrouded in red mana, along the threads of the web, triggering a reaction that reached the spider as well. Soon, a flame erupted inside the barrier, engulfing it completely, and in a moment, nothing remained of it. Finally, Chris stood up, indicating that he had completed the task, which left everyone shocked. As he examined the bracelet on his hand, the hero was confident that, thanks to the knowledge he had acquired, he would be able to process the heavy stone. Meanwhile, the mentor, stunned, announced that Chris had completed the task in 7 minutes and 45 seconds. Professor Robert, however, considered the time spent to be insignificant. Although the young man spent 7 minutes understanding the structure, if he encountered the same barrier again, he would destroy it in a matter of seconds. He didn't limit himself to simply destroying the barrier, but developed a formula that would destroy the spell from the root. Erica watched his retreating figure with surprise and admiration. If he combines magic with his forging skills, it's scary to imagine what legendary tools he could create. Later, the Academy's entire inbox was filled with messages about an application for student Chris to conduct the forging process. Only Michael did not submit an application, meaning that the rumors of tension due to his son's fall to second place were true. While the employee was preparing to choose one of the candidates, he suddenly froze in shock when he saw another letter. He read a sudden message that the dean of the faculty herself was taking charge of the forging process of student Chris. Meanwhile, in the blacksmith shop, Chris stood holding a heavy stone and the necessary materials when he heard his name being called. Rebecca stood in front of him. The woman said that as the dean, she decided to test his skills herself. Chris smiled and turned to his stove, deciding that since things had come this far, he should show the best of his abilities. This was the first stage of forging the dark, heavy stone began. The inkstone has many ways to work with it. However, the hero chose the most difficult method, the so-called dark curtain method. This method was based on placing a dark, heavy stone in a completely light-free space. The stone began to flow into the liquid like water. The task was to separate out the impurities using only mana. During this complex process, the size of the stone was significantly reduced, but its purity was doubled. Chris realized that in theory it all looked simple, but in practice it was like completely rebuilding the material from scratch. Its size has been reduced to a quarter, and further reduction will lead to insufficient effectiveness of future weapons. Chris then moved on to the second stage, gathering the energy and concentrating it in his hand. He released a glowing red flame and directed it forward. He then began to pass mana through it, selecting suitable sparks for the forging process. Gradually, the fire changed color to bright green. This flame had the property of maintaining the temperature at which it was created. In the third and final stage, the hero enveloped his hammer in these green lights and brought it down with all his might on the heavy stone. Rebecca understood that although Chris's fire immunity protected him from being burned, he felt the heat and pain emanating from the force of the flames. Deep down, she wondered how much stress and effort Chris had put in to reach this level. Time dragged on slowly at the academy, and soon evening arrived. Even the dean herself tried to fight off the approaching drowsiness. After 4 continuous hours of forging, Chris's hands began to shake from extreme exhaustion. However, the protagonist continued to clutch the heavy hammer, refusing to give up. Finally, the dark, heavy stone was completely saturated with fire, reaching its limit. Its properties began to change, after which it stopped deforming. Chris then moved on to the next step, using tongs to melt the processed stone and place it in a melting crucible. The hero then began pouring the black liquid into a pre-prepared form, which surprised Rebecca. She wondered why he used casting instead of forging. At that moment, Chris smiled confidently and said that the 4th stage was beginning. Rebecca realized that he was using the barrier-breaking formula to slow down the transformation of the heavy stone. The next moment, the mold collapsed and a message appeared, announcing the completion of the ink spider bracelet. At the same time, Chris was breathing heavily, as this work had completely exhausted his strength. Chris looked at the bracelet, which was of a rare rank of medium quality and had the ability to absorb the owner's mana. Now he finally realized that the process had been successful. Then the hero approached Rebecca, and at that moment her stomach growled loudly. This caused her great embarrassment. At that moment the hero sighed wearily. Rebecca wondered if what had happened was a manifestation of the resonance phenomenon, to which Chris replied that it indeed was. The bracelet isn't very powerful at this point, but with some careful planning, Chris can use it to get the full range of effects. He then took out a bowl containing the remains of the processed dark stone and expressed regret that he could not offer her the real thing. However, the hero hoped that for now she would be satisfied with this. The dean's unique skill, soul-melting furnace, activated as the girl picked up one of the pieces and put it in her mouth. Chris was surprised when she said it was perfectly edible. Rebecca, continuing to chew, said the taste was like fried crumbs. Chris was surprised by this description, but came to the conclusion that at this rate he could quite easily increase the level of connection with her. Then he calmly noted that he was glad that she liked the dish. Rebecca said she felt sorry to eat the leftovers, looking at the magnificent equipment he left on the table. Then the woman asked when he planned to process the 5-colored fire sword and the flame accumulator scabbard. Chris replied that he had no intention of selling them yet, and then Rebecca asked if the price she had offered was too low. Chris explained that he would save them to prepare for the suppression lesson, recalling the proverb that hunger is the best seasoning for food. He promised that if he succeeded in creating worthy equipment, he would let her know, to which the dean said that she would wait for that day. Rebecca then asked if he had completed all the forging work for the day, and Chris confirmed that he had. Then she suggested leaving the premises, noting that the staff would take care of cleaning, which was a real relief for the hero. Chris tried to get up, but his strength failed him and he began to fall backwards. Rebecca reacted quickly and managed to catch him before he hit the ground. She asked worriedly if he was okay. In response, Chris smiled weakly and admitted that he had made a slight mistake in the distribution of stamina. Then Rebecca offered to walk him to his dorm and suddenly asked if he was afraid of heights. Chris said with a smile that he didn't feel that fear. The next moment, Rebecca surprised him by picking him up in her arms and lifting him into the air with the power of fire. She rose rapidly above the academy buildings. As they flew forward, Chris watched in amazement. He thought about the enormous power she had been able to extract just by absorbing the remains of the stone casting. Chris admitted that much had already changed compared to his past life before returning in time. Meanwhile, Erica stood alone in front of the main building, wondering why Chris was late. The fact is that she intended to convey to him a special invitation, but her long wait did not go unnoticed. Her photo quickly circulated on the academy's bulletin board, accompanied by taunts about the reason for such a long wait. Chris decided that if it was really important, she would come again and wait for him. Meanwhile, the door to the auditorium opened. Teacher Ricardo Miles walked inside, introduced himself to the students, and announced the start of a lesson on understanding instruments. He immediately told everyone to head to the training center, and the last one to arrive would be forced to run 20 laps around the stadium. Immediately after this, the students rushed to the exit, desperately trying to avoid severe punishment. Chris joined the run along with the others, puzzled, as the lesson was expected to be theoretical. However, he still continued to run. Following the crowd, the young man arrived at the wide arena late. As a result, he was given a punishment of 20 laps. He ran, breathing heavily and trying to overcome the growing fatigue. At this point, the students were discussing how weak his body was and wondering how he had even passed the intermediate forging. Ricardo then gathered the students in front of him, explaining that this lesson was originally supposed to be theoretical. It was supposed to be devoted to studying the structure of weapons, but the program was changed for an emergency reason. The reason was the attacks on blacksmiths who created heroic rank fire swords, which were called the Hunt for Blades of Flame. No matter how strong a blacksmith's armor, his body remains the last line of defense. Based on this, Ricardo announced that the new goal of the class was to give students real self-defense skills. After this, the mentor moved on to the practical part. Chris, however, realized the need to be extremely careful to compensate for his severe lack of stamina. The hero then used the properties of the Dark Spider Bracelet, a process that significantly enhanced all of his physical characteristics. After running, Chris stopped, breathing heavily as the surge of energy in his body dried up, and then Ricardo ordered him to come over. The hero immediately activated the explosive ring. As he walked towards the teacher, he noticed that his physical condition looked much better than he expected. The mentor then raised his sword and said that he wanted him to strike it to test his level of fencing. Chris took the sword and thought, realizing that the bracelet was restricting his movements and preventing him from acting freely. Even though the technique he thought of was imperfect, Chris decided to use it. Then the young man delivered a straight blow with his sword, but the mentor easily blocked it. One of the students remarked that Chris was very slow, but his punch and fighting stance were executed perfectly. Ricardo, however, was amazed by the trajectory of the sword, which was flawless, as if it was wielded by a master who knew exactly his target. However, Chris was in too much of a hurry, and Ricardo decided to point this out to him and move on. And then he suddenly noticed the hero's terrifying gaze. At this moment, the mentor's gaze widened. In his head, he imagined an attack that he could neither block nor avoid. He literally felt the sword piercing him, and these thoughts made him freeze in horror. Ricardo was shocked, wondering how a technical student could instill such fear in him. He was so scared that he began to hallucinate and even imagined the inevitable blow. This prompted him to inquire as to who had taught Chris this style of fencing. Chris then reflected on how he had mastered this skill, which he said took him only 10 minutes of training. He acquired this skill in the past, while paying off a debt to an old man. He didn't have the money to pay for the instrument, so he offered to teach him one technique instead. However, Chris gave his mentor an evasive answer, saying that he had supposedly learned this by watching fights, which left him puzzled. Despite such a vague answer, the mentor suggested that he take up fencing more seriously. Ricardo decided to write him a letter of recommendation for a lecture at the Akarkuf faculty, which specialized in body control. Later that day, Chris headed there, and upon arrival, Chris witnessed a chaotic scene. The teacher kicked out a student, Jake Myers, refusing to teach him anything. The hero couldn't believe his eyes when he learned the professor's identity. It was Kwansu, a retired S-rank hero, swordbreaker. Chris was surprised, because the old man, whom he knew as a lover of gambling and alcohol, was actually a professor. Chris stepped forward, introducing himself as a first-year forging student and presenting a letter of recommendation from his mentor, Ricardo. Meanwhile, Jake quietly informed the professor that the newcomer was the best student in the Borsippa faculty this year. However, Kwansu didn't seem to show any interest and continued to look at Chris with obvious disdain. Then the teacher suddenly put forward a condition. He said that he would accept him as a student only if he could defeat the young man standing in front of him. After this, the professor announced that there would be only one duel. The winner will be the one who lands a clean hit first. At the sound of the signal, the battle began. Chris immediately assumed a defensive stance. Kwansu understood that she increased her flexibility by abandoning brute physical force. His opponent quickly realized that the best response to such a stance was a direct approach, and so he immediately rushed forward. Kwansu noted with irritation that Chris's opponent had begun to apply psychological pressure even before the actual clash. Meanwhile, Jake was already approaching Chris at full speed. The young man tried to grab the hero to prevent him from striking. At that moment, Chris felt a tremendous power emanating from him. Jake was able to easily knock him onto his back and was already preparing to deliver a clean blow. However, he was surprised when Chris suddenly used the explosive ring skill. Energy immediately began to accumulate in the bracelet on his arm. He ended up knocking them both to the ground with crushing force. Thus, the fight ended with Chris's victory. Jake was still in shock, as just a moment ago he had been sure that victory was in his hands. But now, seeing the abrasion and drops of blood on his nose, he realized that he had lost. Chris, with a slight smile, said that he was a little faster. After a short pause, the defeated youth reflected on the attack that had just occurred. Kwansu then ordered everyone to come out, saying that he promised to train Jake if he won. However, Chris, with a sly smile, suggested that since he was the one who struck the blow, perhaps he should be the one to train. The hero realized what a scandal could break out if it became known that the best student, Akarkuf, had been defeated by a student from Borsippa. The professor agreed and decided that he was at least obliged to make a man out of that blockhead who could earn his own living. Hearing this, Jake was delighted, and the teacher said that he would set a time for training. The young man bowed deeply, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to study, but the professor indicated that he should leave. However, Chris remained where he was, after which Kwangsu said that he wanted to discuss something special with him. The professor asked Chris to demonstrate the sword technique he supposedly used against Ricardo, and the hero immediately agreed. Chris assumed an attack stance. Then he suddenly rushed forward, delivering a quick blow. However, the professor blocked it without any difficulty, and noted that this technique relied entirely on the element of surprise. He then said that the idea itself was not bad, but the execution was extremely weak. Kwansu grabbed the sword and wondered what the point of a technique that becomes a burden to the user after the first use was. After this, he sternly reprimanded Chris, saying that if he had taught this to anyone else, he would not hesitate to break his limbs. However, the professor promised that he would form a body for him suitable for using this technique. Chris then took the opportunity to ask if his registration for the course had been confirmed, and the professor said it had. After a short pause, the hero bowed respectfully and asked permission to leave for the day. As Chris left the room, the professor muttered quietly, amazed at the young man's audacity. Outside, Jake was waiting for the hero, and Chris told him that Kwansu was very arrogant, despite the fact that he was only a teacher. However, Jake stopped Chris and said that he wanted to tell him something. He handed him an elegant black envelope, sealed with wax, which turned out to be an invitation to a meeting of the nobility. Chris wondered if this was the invitation Erica had been about to give him. Jake explained that even though the meeting was full of arrogant people, it would be a good opportunity for him. Chris hesitated for a moment, but the young man stated that it was just a sign of gratitude for helping him enroll in the course. Chris eventually accepted the envelope, thanked him, and moved on. Thinking about the specializations he had already applied to, he considered barrier construction and body control, and also considered the possibility of studying specialization at the Borsippa faculty. Lost in thought, Chris accidentally bumped into a girl with reddish-brown hair who immediately apologized. However, her attention was drawn to the bracelet on his arm. The girl immediately asked if he had created it. Chris answered the question with a question, asking what would happen if it really was him. Then the girl with a mysterious smile offered to enchant his bracelet, and the hero immediately saw a message about establishing a connection with Leah Claudel. This girl was a genius who would later become famous for creating a legendary weapon, raising its rank by 2 levels at once. Leah looked closely at Chris's bracelet, realizing that it was a rare item made from heavy ore. She muttered quietly about the possibility of adding more formulas, but then stopped herself, deciding that the bracelet was too valuable to risk it. While the girl was confused, Chris, who was calmly watching her, asked if the bracelet was bad. Then Leah enthusiastically explained that the problem wasn't the bracelet at all, but the excessive ideas that came to her mind when she looked at it. She was surprised at how well it worked with magic, and admitted that she couldn't even decide which formulas to use. Then Chris calmly said that it was not a problem. The girl was surprised by such an answer, after which the hero showed her another exactly the same bracelet. Chris added that these bracelets have a resonance effect, and this information caused a storm of delight in the girl. After this, Leah asked him seriously about his identity. In response, Chris introduced himself as a first-year student in the blacksmithing department. However, at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a young man standing nearby. He turned to Chris, saying that they needed to talk and asked him to step away for a while. Leah was unhappy that their conversation was interrupted, while Chris wondered if this young man was one of Erica's followers. Even though the stranger wanted to talk privately, Chris refused and insisted that he tell him everything right there. The guy then demanded that Chris apologize to Erica for tearing up the invitation she had given him in front of everyone. However, Chris calmly said that it was the girl who asked him to do this. The young man claimed that his words could have been true if not for the fact that Chris received another invitation from Myers. Then Chris asked if Erica had sent him. The young man denied this, claiming that he was acting of his own free will. Then Leah intervened, smiling sarcastically. She asked if there was anyone who didn't know that he was just the young master's watchdog. These words angered the young man. He released a powerful dark energy and said that Chris was deceiving himself, thinking that he was someone special. He then reminded them that Babylon was full of those who were far superior to it. However, Chris responded to him mockingly, asking if he was talking about himself. This answer finally infuriated the enemy, and the young man then screamed and unleashed his full attack. She took the form of a ghostly blue monster, which rushed towards the hero and the girl. At that moment, Chris was forced to protect Leah. However, the hero soon realized that the attack was not only made of mana, but was an illusion. That guy uses a real dagger as a conduit to deal physical damage. The young man wondered in amazement how he had been able to recognize this. However, Chris only said indifferently that it didn't matter and grabbed the dagger. With a sly smile, he noted that it looked delicious, and at that moment a window about the activation of gluttonous iron appeared in front of him. The young man shouted that the dagger was worth $1 million, while Chris remarked that the taste was enough to drive one crazy. Chris then counterattacked using the explosive ring technique. He rushed forward and delivered a powerful blow. With just one blow, he knocked his opponent to the ground. When the attacker's magic dissipated, Chris turned to Leah. He asked what activities she could recommend to him. The girl thought for a moment, after which she suggested that he enroll in classes at the magic faculty. Meanwhile, the guy was walking down the alley, staggering and not believing that the freshman could compete with him on equal terms at such a level. Suddenly, Erica appeared in front of him and asked him to show her the dagger. The young man was amazed by her appearance and wondered from what point she had been watching what was happening. He handed her the dagger in confusion. Looking at him, the girl said that he should not tell her brother about what happened, since she herself would notify the head of the family. Erica immediately noticed the anti-theft spell engraved on the dagger, which was expected for a guide weapon. However, she wondered if Chris had developed a counter-skill based on Professor Robert's theory and her own magic. Meanwhile, Chris studied the set of daggers. He came to the conclusion that its efficiency in improving techniques was not inferior to S rank. Suddenly, a window appeared in front of him informing him that a connection had been established with Erica Inoue, which surprised him. Chris realized that the girl had been watching him during his fight, but he didn't pay any attention to it, considering the daggers a worthy compensation. He noted that, despite their primitiveness, they can be useful when interacting with the thread of the Black Spirit. Chris, meanwhile, was bored listening to Charles. Although he expected a lot, in the end he had to listen to theories that he already knew by heart. Then the professor announced the beginning of the practical part of the lesson. He explained that even if the metal remains the same, its shape can change depending on the structure of the mana within it. It is precisely these applications of shape transformation that determine the diversity and capabilities of weapons. For this reason, the teacher emphasized the importance of the blacksmith understanding the hidden potential of the metal he works with. After that, he announced that on this day they would practice metal transformation using an iron alloy. The students were first tasked with manipulating the mana structure to create a rift and then returning it to its original state. Charles also warned that the alloy had been modified to be particularly sensitive to transformations. Chris concluded that the teacher was not completely opposed to the idea of magical treatment, and then it was announced that 10 minutes were allotted to complete the task. As soon as the signal sounded, the students began working, but most of them encountered serious difficulties. However, 2 students were still able to fulfill the professor's demands. Chris and Hans successfully completed the task almost simultaneously. After this, the professor announced that they were moving on to the next stage. There he will demonstrate the matrix as an example, and students will have to apply it on their own. Hans felt confident, believing that since their speed and skill were equal, he could win this time. The professor then showed an extremely complex matrix and asked to apply it in practice. The young man was able to shape the alloy according to the matrix shown. Hans looked extremely pleased with the result, considering it perfect in every respect. However, the teacher then addressed him by name and ordered him to return the alloy to its original state. Then the guy became confused, and then he suddenly discovered that the mana structure was completely damaged. The professor explained that the alloy was not capable of withstanding such a transformation, meaning that the processing method was incorrect. Hans followed his instructions literally, so he didn't understand what the problem was. Charles replied that he had failed to understand the true potential of the metal, something he had previously emphasized. The teacher went on to explain that if it is impossible to restore the altered matrix, then the mechanism is not transformed, but destroyed. It is this destruction that becomes an important variable affecting quality and productivity. Hans then wondered if Chris had noticed the trap, but he soon dismissed the thought, deciding that perhaps he had just been lucky. Suddenly, Chris easily returned his alloy to its original form. Soon, everyone saw a literally perfect result, which caused amazement among the students. They couldn't believe their eyes and wondered how he managed to do it. After the teacher declared that such a thing was impossible, he asked Chris to demonstrate the transformation again. The hero realized that he had deceived the professor and explained that this was only possible because the alloy had been specially modified for students. Then Charles realized that it was all due to the sensitive nature of the alloy. Now he felt very sorry that he himself had not noticed it. At that moment, the memory of Ken's, the greatest blacksmith in history who managed to pass through all the floors of the tower, returned to him. The transformation formula he created, the truth of iron, was considered a fundamental and extremely difficult task for all blacksmiths. Charles thought the formula was impossible to break and asked himself if he really believed the student was capable of such a thing. After the class ended, the teacher called Chris and asked if he had a minute. The boy answered, puzzled as to what was going on. Charles gave him a gift, thanking him for his help and for his decision to join Babylon. When the young man opened the box, inside he found crimson fire jade, a rare ore capable of smelting mixed metals. The professor explained that if he absorbed the essence of this stone, he would be able to permanently strengthen his crimson flame. Chris then thanked his mentor, confirming that this gift would be very useful for him. Charles then asked him if he wanted to sign up for his elective. The hero asked whether they were talking about studying the origins of weapons, surprising the teacher with his knowledge. Chris confirmed that he knew about it, muttering to himself that the course was one of the most well-funded in Babylon. However, Chris hesitated, remembering that before the regression he had not heard Charles's name, which meant that his fate had not turned out well. However, he realized that he was still facing a mentor who was attracting attention, and so he decided to enroll in the course. The teacher was surprised to hear that he had already signed up for several courses, but the hero downplayed this, explaining that there were only 4 of them. Then the professor extended his hand. Chris shook it, and at that very moment a system window appeared in front of him, informing him that the connection had been extracted. He reached the first level of communication, and this allowed him to obtain a unique metal fragment, iron imbued with fire. Chris came to the conclusion that if it was possible to extract minerals from a human, then the human body could also be melted down and processed. He knew that the presence of several monotypes in the body caused a conflict that was deadly to the blacksmith's precision. This is why they usually work with only one attribute, but it was different. After he exhausted the mana that was suppressing the heat in his body, His body became ready to absorb the essence of the crimson flame. Then the young man realized that as a blacksmith, he must create a magical circuit within his body, entirely dedicated to this flame. He eventually decided to remelt himself, and soon a notification appeared that his attribute mana had been strengthened, and the rank of his crimson flame had increased. In addition, he obtained a new S-rank skill, Divine Body Purification Magic, which refines the inner mana circles. As a result of this skill's effect, all of his stats increased significantly. Chris then remembered his past when someone had reproached him for giving up without even trying to use the materials available. The girl sarcastically asked how he even expected to succeed this way. This memory awakened determination in him, and the hero firmly decided that this time he would use everything he had. He promised himself not to leave any regrets, no matter who the person he was about to face was, a future ally or an enemy. Another day, already in the workshop, Khan announced that they had to complete the pieces they had worked on in previous classes. He also noted that what they create today will determine their level of academic performance in the first semester, and therefore urged everyone to try hard. The students responded enthusiastically and set to work. However, Chris felt his work was poor because his body could not keep up with his skills, causing many parts to come out crooked. Chris realized that he had no opportunity to relax or take matters superficially. Then the protagonist continued to deliver successive blows, and sparks flew around him and tongues of flame flared up. The young man then decided that this level of refinement was enough to fix it. However, he understood that he wouldn't have enough time for the rest of the weapons unless he made them at an intermediate level. Nevertheless, the hero came to the conclusion that bringing one weapon to perfect condition is much better than scattering efforts. And then he began to carefully draw the blade across the stone. But suddenly a familiar and frightening sound rang in his ears, the roar of waves, reminiscent of the collapse of the world. Chris knew that every time this mysterious sound occurred, it meant that he had created something great. Then he carefully examined the sword, which now emitted a special glow. Chris realized that the sharpness he had acquired was not temporary. It was a cutting edge inscribed into the very essence of the blade. At that moment, a system window appeared in front of the main character, informing him of the completion of a weapon called White Light. Chris rated the result as quite decent, especially considering that the base was made from regular hardware. Then the young man smiled, feeling how his skills and experience, which he had possessed before the regression, were gradually returning to him. On the other hand, some students complained about the weight of their weapons and the difficulty of the task. The next morning, Saturday, Chris met Leah at one of the outdoor cafes on campus. The hero explained that he was curious to learn the basics of her work, but she said that her personal workspace was more private. Then they walked away from the city together, causing the young man to wonder in surprise if this place was too far away. They soon reached a wooden house with a sign indicating that it was Akarkuf's workshop. As soon as they entered, Leah called loudly to her grandmother, announcing her return. In response, the elderly woman holding the frying pan turned around sharply and said that she was not deaf. Then the old woman looked closely at Chris and asked her granddaughter if he was really her boyfriend. Leah introduced him as the best student of the Borsippa faculty, and the old woman declared that Babylon had fallen into decay. She then introduced herself as Helena, and Chris responded with a polite greeting and said that he was a first-year student in the forging department. Then Helena ordered her granddaughter not to waste time and start working, because due to the new students, they had a lot of work to do this week. Then the elderly woman said she was glad to see them and pointed towards the workshop. Chris noticed the quality of the tools and concluded that this woman's skills were much higher than he expected. He then wondered why she was running a hardware store in such a secluded place. Leah then drew his attention to the makeup palette and explained that the colored powders in it were made from crushed monostones. Chris looked at the palette, remembering that the standard was usually limited to 8 colors, whereas she used a much wider range. He clarified whether he understood correctly that her task was to restore damaged magical formulas with the help of these powders. Leah confirmed that this was the case and explained that this type of work allowed her to earn money and practice magic at the same time. Then the girl took a brush and dipped it into the glowing gold powder. After Leah began to apply the magic formula to the back of the frying pan, a glowing magic circle formed there. Chris remembered at that moment that he had come here because in his past life, he had heard about the stagnation and decline of the magic faculty. Then he remembered the words of that guy who said that Leah failed all the exams and couldn't even hold on to first place. However, looking at Leah and seeing such a level of talent, the hero fully understood the real reason for this stagnation. Chris smiled softly, realizing that her ability to completely lose herself in what she was doing was a real talent in itself. Chris examined the enchanted frying pan and noticed how the magic harmonized with the mana circles, giving the tool special properties. He realized that his hands were yearning to engrave white light again after a long break. Helena, seeing his desires, offered him to use something and choose any item from the accumulated pile of tools. At that moment, the hero cast a displeased glance at her, wondering if she was trying to take advantage of him. However, his attention was soon drawn to a specialized and high-quality sharpening stone. Then the hero smiled, deciding that having a tool of such a level was worth trying. Helena watched him with interest, wondering why he had chosen this particular subject. Meanwhile, Chris carefully examined the knife and noticed that it was made by a true master who was well versed in working with blades. After this, the young man set to work, believing that the knife's creator would be able to use it brilliantly even if it were sharpened to the limit. Chris then began sharpening the blade with quick, smooth movements, much to Helena's amazement. She wondered in shock if this guy was really just a freshman who had entered the academy this year. At that moment, Leah screamed joyfully and raised the frying pan up, saying that she had finished the job. However, she noticed her grandmother and asked when she arrived, to which Helena sarcastically said that she herself did not know. The girl then scolded Helena, saying that she tried to find mistakes in the students, but in the end she got a lesson herself. However, Grandma flicked Leah on the forehead so quickly that her glasses flew off and demanded that she shut up. She then turned to Chris and asked if he had finished his work. The protagonist, with a confident smile, replied that he had done everything possible and promised to show an even better result in the future. Then the old woman sighed heavily and said that they should leave. Leah began to grumble about her grandmother's bad mood and walked Chris outside. Meanwhile, Helena was left alone and looked thoughtfully at the knife he had left on the table. At that moment, a man in a pinstripe suit burst into the workshop, calling out to her and asking if she was busy forging. Helena gave him a sharp look and demanded that he speak more quietly. Then the man apologized and explained that he had a lot of orders accumulated. He ignored her reproaches and told her not to interfere in other people's hobbies. Then he took a knife from the table. As soon as the man looked at the blade, his expression changed, and he asked Helena if she had gotten drunk and sharpened it. The woman denied it, and then the man suggested that one of her assistants had done it, given their noticeable increase in skill. However, Helena surprised him by telling him that it was a freshman who did it, and these words shocked the man. Then the elderly woman seriously confirmed that she was talking about a student who had entered the academy this year. At the same time, she herself, deep down, was pondering the true identity of this mysterious young man. Meanwhile, Chris and Leah were walking together outside, and the girl told them that Helena had previously been a professor in the forging department. However, she resigned 5 years ago and opened a store, and many faculty members have left the department over the past decade. Chris came to the conclusion that in the future, the forging department would become the weakest in Babylon, which meant he couldn't ignore it. At this point, Leah asked for his assessment of her enchantment, and Chris praised her for having a solid foundation free of errors. The girl laughed sheepishly, but the hero unexpectedly pointed out directly that her thinking was narrow and limited. The young man explained that she had thought of a more effective way to perform magic, but had not decided to use it. Chris said that ignorance can be removed by education, but the real problem is having knowledge without applying it. He also confirmed that the creator's imagination is his main weapon and talent, and that she suppresses this talent within herself. Leah bitterly recalled her past failures and justified herself by admitting that she understood this. Meanwhile, Chris took out his tool and began to explain his idea in practice, saying that she should concentrate carefully. If we imagine the task as the need to place a stone underwater, then forging consists of creating this stone and placing it. At the same time, the role of magic is to carve the image of this stone so that it appears above the surface of the water. He then demonstrated this in practice, and this spectacle caused Leah great amazement and admiration. Chris explained to Leah that the real enhancement was not given to the weapon's appearance, but was embedded deep within its internal structure. The hero then added that if one layer is not enough, magic can be divided into several layers. The next moment, the young man threw the knife forward with a sharp movement and it pierced the air, creating a shockwave. The blade pierced the tree trunk, and a white, cutting flash of energy erupted from it after the crimson ring. Chris noted to himself that what he had demonstrated could not be called full-fledged magic, but it was quite sufficient. Leah was lost in thought, and the hero was finally convinced that geniuses always find a way to develop even in moments of doubt. Suddenly, the girl broke the silence and demanded that he lend her the knife. She began to shake him, begging and promising that she would reforge him properly and return him back. Yielding to her persistence, Chris calmly handed her a whole set of knives, saying that she could have them all. Then Leah literally jumped with joy, expressing gratitude and even declaring that she adored Chris. At that moment, a system window appeared in front of Chris, informing him that the first-level connection with Leah Claudel had been extracted. The hero only smiled to himself, amazed by her youthful energy, overflowing with vitality. Later, in the arena stands, Chris waited for the event to begin, thinking that today would finally be his meeting with one of the three dogs. At that moment, his thoughts were interrupted by Erica, who was standing right behind him, and the hero then asked what she was doing. The girl, with a completely emotionless expression on her face, said that she was following him, and Chris asked if she would leave if he asked her to. She immediately agreed, but added that in that case she would simply observe him from a close distance. Eventually, the protagonist relented and invited her to go inside together, while the system displayed the materials he had received through connections. The first was a 4-pointed stone obtained from Erica, capable of correcting the damaged internal structure of mana. The second was a composite burst from Leah, which enhanced the potential of mixed materials to the limit. Meanwhile, the presenter welcomed the new students and announced that a classification battle would take place today. She introduced herself as Renee, the youngest professor in the martial arts department. She then began introducing the participants, announcing the entrance of the arena champion, a 4th-year student and representative of the Myers family. She held the top spot for 3 years in a row and was described as the ideal A-rank hero. To thunderous applause from the audience, Arya Myers, known as the Saint of the Sword and the Conqueror of the Tower of Heroes, entered the arena. Chris and Erica watched the proceedings among the cheering crowd as the host announced the first contender. He turned out to be the best 3rd-year student of the Spear Combat Department, occupying 10th place and the heir to the Spear Smoldering Flame Wheel. Chris smiled slightly as he saw the young man enter the arena. That man was none other than Mad Dog Sam. The fight broke out instantly, Sam unleashing a series of powerful and consistent attacks on Arya with his flaming spear. However, the champion blocked his blows flawlessly. As a result, the young man was forced to retreat. Sam gritted his teeth against the pressure and frustration. Arya, however, remained calm and confident. She used a circular protective aura to easily reflect his fiery attacks. Chris watched the fight, noticing that Sam's performance level was not up to par even considering his age. He wondered in his heart whether this heir to a great technology had been deprived of proper support and guidance. The hero carefully analyzed the details of the battle and came to the conclusion that Sam's style had many annoying flaws. However, the most obvious and serious problem was the weapon he held in his hands. The duel ended with Arya putting her sword to his neck. Deciding that there was no point in fighting any further, Sam admitted his defeat. The girl stood proudly and was declared the winner. The arena erupted in applause, after which host Renee announced that she intended to conduct interviews with the participants. However, Sam had already left the arena early due to special circumstances. Arya then laughed, saying that even for her, it would be difficult to fight a 9th-rank fighter right away. The presenter then suggested replacing the interview with a question-and-answer session, which drew cheers from the crowd. The protagonist noticed the young man's gloomy mood, so he stood up, deciding to leave. Erica asked if he was going to leave the arena without watching the whole thing, to which he replied that he didn't like such events. Chris walked down the stands, silently calling Arya annoying. Erica didn't understand the reasons for his irritation, although she was relieved that he hadn't come because of her eldest. Meanwhile, she was attracted by the voice of the winner coming from the arena. Arya watched him with curiosity. Finding him an interesting freshman, she noted with a mysterious smile that perhaps someone worthy of her attention had appeared. In the garden near the martial arts hall, Sam sat alone, sighing heavily. Chris walked up to him with quiet steps, looking at him carefully. The hero remembered that despite his bad character, Sam would become the mainstay of the Death Squad and sacrifice himself to overthrow the god of the Sea of Death. Chris hoped that this time he could get the Destiny Stone peacefully before the young man lost his mind. So he spoke to him first, asking if he had been following the fight. Sam turned his head slightly and recognized him as the best student of the Borsippa faculty and sharply asked why he was here. Chris was surprised by such a hostile reaction and tried to defuse the situation by saying that he would like to talk to him. However, the young man rudely refused and demanded that he leave. Then the protagonist insisted, explaining that this conversation would be useful for him as well, and asked to listen at least once. This persistence caused Sam to become angry, and he declared that he hated weaklings who couldn't do anything for themselves. In the end, he told Chris to forget about it and go away. The hero fell silent, comparing what was happening to the future, where Sam would become a mad dog, and noted that now he looked more polite. Then the main character realized that this situation could not be resolved with words. Sam looked at him sharply, realizing that Chris wasn't going to back down. In response, the hero said that he would say only one thing. With a confident tone, the young man declared that the legacy of the smoldering flame wheel spear would end with him. These words drove Sam to the limit of rage, and he immediately rushed into the attack. The next moment, he delivered a direct blow. In response, Chris activated the Fate imprint, causing his fist to glow with powerful energy. The hero delivered a powerful blow that dispersed the flaming spear's attack and sent Sam flying back. He was shocked that the blacksmith was able to block a blow saturated with his mana. He admitted to himself that Chris deserved the title of top student, and perhaps he really was worth talking to. At that moment, Sam noticed that a trace of his mana still remained in the air, and he gathered his strength, preparing to demonstrate the true power of the spear. He then attacked with all his might, unleashing a huge fire blast and saying that this was the end. Suddenly, an explosion occurred at the site of their skirmish, but it was not the main character that was thrown back, but Sam himself. Chris, with a simple and calm movement of his hand, managed to dispel this attack and completely extinguish it. Sam froze in shock. The sparks that should have been controlled only by his mana were now between Chris's hands. Sam was deeply shocked. His opponent not only stopped the attack, but was also able to capture the essence of his energy and control it. After that, he tried to attack the hero again, but missed. A confident smile appeared on Chris's face. At that moment, he realized that his opponent was close to completely losing control of himself. Then he remembered the future, where Sam's unstable nature led to the terrible massacre of the Fireflower sect. Realizing that he was facing a man with a dangerous nature, Chris ignored his anger. Meanwhile, Sam himself rushed to block the next attack. However, the hero felt that the skill's effect was coming to an end and his body had reached its limit. It is no longer possible to establish a peaceful connection with this young man, and to achieve the goal it will be necessary to suppress him by force. But before he could deliver the decisive blow, someone stopped them. It turned out that Jake Myers suddenly intervened and stopped Sam's fist at the last moment, which greatly surprised Chris. Sam asked him if he knew the best student in the Borsippa faculty, and he said that he only knew him partially. After this, Sam ordered them to move away, and Jake immediately obeyed. He then grabbed Chris and enthusiastically pulled him along with him, leading him away. As they walked away, Chris tried to say something, but the young man interrupted him, telling him to be quiet and quicken his pace. Meanwhile, Sam was left alone, gradually coming to his senses, overcome with regret for having lost his composure. He revealed his power in such a way that he almost threatened the reputation of his master in the martial art. Jake began to scold Chris for his recklessness, which almost cost him his life, and asked why he had provoked the older student. However, the hero only responded with a joke, but admitted to himself that the situation was indeed dangerous. The hero thought, comparing Sam's current relatively calm character with the crazy dog he would become in the future. Chris then turned his attention to Jake and asked if his hand was okay. Jake laughed heartily and said that his arms were the strongest part of his body and there was no need to worry about them. After that, he became serious and asked an important question, inquiring about what Chris said about his older sister, Arya Myers, in the arena. The protagonist responded indifferently that he hadn't said anything special, but had only noted that she was a little arrogant. These words made Jake's eyes widen in shock, and he realized that this was why his sister was asking so many questions about Chris. The young man then came to the conclusion that his sister had shown a genuine interest in Chris. To Chris's surprise, it turned out that Arya had actually heard their conversation despite the noise of the crowd. But Chris only smiled. Arya's interest was exactly what he was looking for, because he knew that Sam's main obsession was winning over her. Jake warned his friend against taking this lightly, noting that he didn't know his sister well. In response, the hero described her as a person of narrow thinking and prone to intrigue. However, the blonde softened his words, admitting that he might have exaggerated a little. This made Jake wonder about the real reason why Chris disliked his sister so much. Chris's memory turned to Arya Myers, the Saint of the Sword. The hero knew that in reality her famous sword was nothing special. Suddenly, Arya disappeared without warning, and in her place appeared a demonic blade created from the remains of a demon god. After this, Arya turned into a dark being, embodying the god of destruction. Chris concluded his thoughts with an enigmatic smile and noted that it was clear from her face that she was troubled. Then the main character said goodbye to Jake. The guy remained standing there, confusedly trying to comprehend what had happened. Suddenly, he received a message from his sister Arya, asking him to continue to tell her news about this interesting young man. He had barely read the message when another beep sounded, making him tremble with fear. It was his sister again, pretending to be friendly and asking him to do her a favor. Then Jake sighed heavily and continued walking, resigned to his fate. The next morning, Chris sat in the lecture hall and wondered if he had overdone it in his fight with Sam the previous day. At that moment, the office door opened and a miniature man walked inside. Teacher Riz Dova announced that he would be teaching them classes for the next 2 weeks, and that the topic of the lesson would be attribute forging. The students began to whisper, as this professor was known for his eccentricity and unpredictable behavior. Reese explained that he would show them the budget allocation for the first semester, and then began calling the students one by one. He finally named Chris, while the others expected his budget to be at least 3 times their own. However, the teacher suddenly announced that his budget had not yet been determined, which left Chris puzzled. Reese explained that the level of craftsmanship in his work was extremely high, which is why it was chosen to be displayed at auction. Then the protagonist thought that this could be part of Vice Dean Michael's plan against him. However, he soon calmed down, deciding that Professor Charles would have stopped it if there had been a real problem. Reese then announced that the topic of the class was residual mana, and reported that one of the students had volunteered to help with the explanation. After this, he invited his assistant to come in, and everyone was surprised when Sam, a third-year student of the spearfighting department, entered the classroom. The students were amazed that he would help in their class, but Reese pointed out that they should show the same interest in their studies. After a brief introduction, he asked us to focus on the basic concepts before moving on to practice. The teacher then began his explanation, clarifying that the residual mana when creating a weapon manifests itself in 2 main forms. The first type is standard cumulative, and the second, autonomous, either generates mana itself or absorbs it from the environment. Each type has its own advantages and disadvantages, but the standalone version is the most difficult to create. So he advised the students to focus on the accumulative type for now, and then asked the assistant to speak. Sam then summoned dense red mana, and Reese explained that fire mana was highly unstable and difficult to use. However, when this feature is suppressed, it acquires a remarkable stability. This is exactly what Sam demonstrated by forming glowing rings of fire, a technique known as the smoldering flame wheel. The students were impressed by his control over the fire mana, and even Hans admitted that he could barely control it using an entire furnace. Then Reese urged them to take advantage of the presence of a strong assistant and gave them a new assignment that had to be submitted by the following Thursday. He said that the theme of the task would be the accumulation of residual fire element mana, but the students could create any items. He then ordered everyone to go to the processing room and change for work. Hans saw this as an opportunity to bond with the senior and enthusiastically approached him, greeting him. However, Sam interrupted him with an icy glare and told him to stay away. Then the boy and his friends retreated, feeling humiliated. Meanwhile, Sam watched Chris as he headed towards the exit. He called out his name, clearly intending to speak privately. He stopped him and asked him sharply what he knew about him. Chris began his explanation by pointing out that the level of mastery of the residual fire spear technique was determined by the number of fire wheels. The hero added that Sam controlled 3 wheels with ease, but if he had put in all his effort, he could have held 6 at the same time. Hearing this, the young man hurried after him and demanded an explanation. However, Chris suddenly noted that Sam had already reached the 7-wheel level, and these words shocked the young man. Chris added that Sam suddenly lost the ability to control this number of wheels and hid it even from his great mentor. He explained that he had a certain talent in working with fire and was therefore able to notice a flaw in the boy's style when he used flames. He said that Sam was misusing his hidden potential, allowing it to leak away and dissipate. The young man then asked Chris with anticipation if he knew the cause of this problem. The hero confirmed this, continuing to walk forward, but added that he saw no reason to explain this to him. These words left Sam confused. Eventually, the young man resigned himself to the situation and asked what he wanted. Chris then began to lay out his terms, stating that any advice or assistance would be provided at a fair price. He also added that Sam would have to consult with him on any issues that he found difficult. Sam demanded that he explain the matter first before they reached the forge. However, without waiting for an answer, he agreed to the conditions, and yet Sam asked to provide evidence of the truth of what was said. Later that day, in the workshop, the students whispered to each other as they watched Chris. They were surprised by his method of work, which seemed chaotic. He threw materials straight into the furnace without thinking, without paying attention to proportions. The main character mixed fire ore and dark ore in a ratio of 7:3. The others were puzzled as to how the best student could act so unprofessionally, as such an approach would dissipate the mana. However, Chris, with full concentration, began to heat the mixture until elemental mana began to emerge from it. He then used an advanced technique, simultaneously manipulating flames and mana, causing the material to absorb elemental energy. This technique was known as thermal substitution. Reese watched the scene with admiration, realizing that this was the reason Chris's work had been accepted into the auction. The hero himself smiled confidently, realizing that to others this looked like a normal method, but Sam probably saw a different picture. The proof he demanded was unfolding before him, and so he could only watch intently. Chris actually swapped the properties of the two energies. He kept the fiery mana inside and brought the dark mana directed inward, out. As a result, the opposing energies balanced each other, forming a perfect closed circle of harmony. At this point, Sam realized the truth. He was advised to get rid of his second attribute due to its incompatibility with the spear. But in fact, this dark mana was the key to success. The young man felt regret for his ignorance and admitted that it was from that moment that his level began to decline. Chris interrupted his thoughts and presented the result of his work. He was able to create a wheel of black flame, but his strength was not enough for 6 wheels. Sam explained that the Fireflower Gate regularly sends mentors to check on the progress of their heirs who have entered the world. There is a strict rule that if an heir's level drops below the 6th wheel, he is immediately stripped of his status. Then Chris suggested that he try the old method at least once. However, the young man categorically refused, admitting that he was no longer able to control his dark mana. Chris asked when the inspecting mentor would arrive, and Sam, with a heavy sigh, replied that it would happen the next day. Then Chris thought about the young man's situation. If he lost his status as heir, he would be immediately expelled from the academy. This prompted him to look for a solution that could be implemented in just one day. The hero then turned to him and asked him directly if he was ready to do anything to maintain his position. Sam answered confidently that he was ready. After this, Chris smiled with relief, and a system window appeared in front of him, informing him that the unique stone had been extracted from Sam. With a confident smile, the protagonist handed the stone to Sam and announced that the first step of their plan would be to modify his weapon. Later, the young man revealed that this was the personal training room of the Akarku faculty, and that only the top 100 students could use it. However, Chris abruptly interrupted him, telling him to stop bragging. Then the hero announced that he was going to change the situation a little. Using the control panel, I quickly transformed the room, which took on the appearance of a traditional hall of fire gates. Afterwards, he mockingly asked if it made him feel nostalgic. Sam replied that the master had given him this design. Chris then suggested starting by creating training tools while holding a glowing ball of red energy in the hand. Soon, thanks to his ability to extract affinity, a system window appeared in front of him, confirming the properties of the obtained stone. The hero then handed Sam 2 short spears, which surprised him, as he hadn't even gotten used to one yet. However, Chris explained that the paired construct is much better suited for working with 2 different attributes at once. After this, the protagonist gave clear instructions. The left hand should form a ring, and the right hand should release dark mana. When Sam asked if they should just release her, Chris confirmed it. However, as soon as the young man tried to follow the instructions, the energy got out of control and exploded. Sam, in shock, tried to understand what had happened. Chris explained that he had unknowingly allowed dark mana to enter his left hand. Overlaying multiple types of mana is fine in itself. The problem is the chaos that causes the energies to interfere with each other. He added that the reason was that Sam had been trying to suppress the dark mana all this time instead of combining it with the fire mana. But he assured Sam that once he got used to using both powers at the same time, achieving the 6 rings would be an easy task for him. After this, the hero gave him special equipment to continue training, and Sam was impressed with the equipment he received. After 3 hours of intense training, he was already fighting using 2 spears while in a whirlwind of fire and dark energy. Chris watched him with approval, noting the speed of his adaptation. The hero considered this to be entirely logical, since this style of training was developed by him in the future. He then decided to test the limits of the young man's talent in the past, and began to carefully analyze every detail of his movements. He examined his breathing, the work of his muscles, the shift in his center of gravity, as well as the waves of mana in his body and escaping through his palms. When Sam asked why he was staring so intently, Chris calmly replied that he was collecting data. The protagonist then explained that he needed this data to create the weapon he would use. However, he warned the young man not to get his expectations too high, as it was only a side project for an academic assignment. In response, Sam noted with irony that he didn't expect much from equipment created by a first-year student. After that, Chris changed the subject and asked why he was so obsessed with maintaining his status as heir. After a short pause, the young man revealed the real reason. His mentor wanted him to become the next head of the sect. Sam explained that as a student, he was only carrying out his will. This mentor was an S-rank hero and the first leader of the Flame Gate, who once adopted an orphaned youth. Despite rumors that he had lost influence after the injury, Chris understood that this man had absolute power over Sam. At that moment, while Chris was thinking that they should improve their relationship, the system window showed that their connection level had reached the 3rd level. And then Sam interrupted his thoughts, asking him directly why he was helping him. Chris then replied that the reason was the 6 great demonic worlds. These are places swallowed by a chaotic swamp and teeming with monsters. He revealed his plan to infiltrate each of these worlds, and to do this he would need people as well as materials to create weapons. If Sam becomes the next head of the Gates of Flame, he will have the skills and resources needed to support them. But he noted that he shouldn't think that he was going to help him out of the kindness of his heart. Sam acknowledged the truth of these words, because any help comes at a price. And then he made a counteroffer. He asked Chris to help him become the head of the gate, promising to follow him in return. And then Chris remembered a scene from his past life. In his past life, Sam only asked him to create a weapon, while he himself took on the destruction of the demon god. Remembering this, the hero smiled. He then took out the red-black affinity stone and asked him if he was sure of his decision and if he would regret it. Chris, with an almost demonic smile, declared that he would make him the head of the sect, even if he himself did not want it. The next day, in the dueling hall, a man in traditional uniform met Sam, addressing him as young master. It was Xander, the mentor of the 7 rings of the Flame Gate. Sam inquired about the identity of the people accompanying him, and Xander explained that they were disciples personally chosen by the head of the sect. Then, with a sly smile, he added that Sam was the most talented after the future head of the sect. However, he abruptly interrupted him, reminding him that the next chapter had not yet been determined, and demanded that he watch his words. Xander then apologized, citing a slip of the tongue, and offered to begin assessing his abilities. The young man refused, after which he confidently stated that he intended to apply for promotion to the level of the 7 rings. These words shocked the mentor, who privately doubted how someone who only knew training could dare to claim the post of head. Xander remembered the man's instructions, who told him to deal with Sam if he was summoned to the level of the 7 rings and promised to settle everything. The mentor reminded that the duel with the instructor begins precisely at the level of the 7 rings. But Sam said that he talks too much. These words angered Xander, who ordered his spear to be brought and announced that the test would be conducted in a duel. Such a duel was a direct clash of strength, where the one whose ring of fire was stronger would win. After the start of the fight was announced, Sam took an offensive stance. The mentor mocked his double spears, calling this style primitive. Xander chided him, wondering if he had forgotten the sect leader's words about suppressing the Dark Star's demonic power. He declared that such crude fires were no match for the true flame. In response, Sam confidently said that the result would be obvious in battle, and Xander threatened that he would regret it. Immediately after this, the battle began rapidly. The opponents exchanged powerful and consistent blows. Sam demonstrated the full power of his flame to the arrogant man. The mentor was shocked by the power of Sam's attacks. He felt that his fire dragon was not just being suppressed, but literally being torn apart. And then Xander suddenly heard his weapon start to crackle strangely. As a result, the young man managed to destroy his opponent's spear. Xander fell to his knees, defeated and shocked. Sam stood confidently with the new weapon in his hands, asking if he still considered his style rough. While Chris was pondering the future, Sam explained that after the promotion ceremony, he would be officially recognized as a gate instructor. Sam explained that there were 2 main conditions to become the head of a cult. The first is reaching the level of 8 rings, and the second is receiving the approval and support of the majority of the sect's mentors. Sam confidently stated that he could reach the level of the 8 rings and win the approval of the mentors through duels. However, he noted that future battles would no longer be simple duels of strength like today's, and therefore would not be so easy. Then Chris, with a sly smile, reminded him that he should think about how he was going to pay for his help. Sam asked for clarification on what exactly was required, promising to provide everything, be it money or materials, within reasonable limits. However, the young man unexpectedly added that he had one more request, surprising Chris with his persistence. Sam looked at the weapon in his hands, acknowledged its quality, but noted that it was only a temporarily borrowed copy. He wondered what kind of legendary spear Chris would create next. even if this weapon was only made in a few hours. With a chuckle, Sam pointed the spear at Chris's back as he walked away, saying that next time he would receive a more practical weapon. The story then shifts to a crowded auction room where spectators gathered to await the start of the event. Soon, the host came on stage and announced the start of a regular auction dedicated to the works of second-year students of the forging department. Chris was in the audience, dressed according to Charles's advice on the importance of appearance, and Eric sat next to him in traditional dress. The hero realized that being the center of attention made it more difficult for his opponents to openly plot against him. Chris glanced at Vice Dean Michael and wondered what plan he was developing to take control of the forging department. The presenter demonstrated a material that was both soft as silk and strong as metal, resistant to cutting impacts. To prove this, the assistant struck the cloth with a powerful blow with his sword, but it remained undamaged. The blade was unable to cut through it and even received damage. Moreover, the sword itself was destroyed by the force of the blow. The presenter explained that this method identifies swords whose creators sacrifice strength for increased cutting ability. After this, the first sword, the work of student Joseph, was presented. Chris watched the proceedings with interest, noting that such a rigorous check indicated serious preparation. He explained that the white tiger's properties are often misinterpreted as if its body were a strong shield. But in reality, it is more complex. Each part of its body has its own characteristics, and its fur, in particular, is capable of imitating the sharpness of metal weapons. Chris understood that this was a carefully planned and open trap aimed against him and Professor Charles. Meanwhile, the sound of the auction hammer rang out in the hall, announcing the sale of sword number 25 for 4,000,000 won. Finally, the host announced that it was the last lot's turn and suggested that the quality check of the white light sword begin. The assistant raised his sword and struck the fabric with all his might, and at the moment of contact, a powerful white aura erupted from the blade. The spectators, including teachers and administrators, watched the event in complete amazement. What happened left everyone perplexed and shocked by what they saw and unable to understand how this weapon could have withstood the test. The sword remained completely intact, shining with a pure white light and completely ignoring the destructive properties of the fabric. When the hero realized that they had failed to set him up, he immediately rose from his seat. Addressing the presenter and the audience, he asked for the opportunity to briefly explain what had happened. Normally, a sword focused on sharpness would easily break on a Sogimpo, but the white light sword gathers the mana scattered in the air and condenses it onto the blade like a fine edge. It was absolutely normal that the audience did not feel it. They would have felt almost no mana. Its density is not high enough to be called sword chi, but since it is too sharp for a light source, it is considered an aura of sharpness. And then Erica realized that that phenomenon was also because of this aura. Chris confirmed her words, saying that when identical auras collide, they cause resonance, not mutual destruction. And using this, he could do something interesting. The hero cut through the high-class four-pointed stone with his sword in an instant. Now he felt that the chaotically fluctuating mana was gradually becoming orderly. All that needed to be added was a clearly defined path. When everything was ready, the sword glowed with bright energy, and its rank was upgraded to epic before the eyes of the audience. Once the transformation was complete, Chris realized that his guess was correct. The blade could not be sharpened with a whetstone, but now he had obtained a simple skill that strengthened the aura of sharpness, and the dream rank had risen from rare to epic. Chris asked the host to reflect this in the starting price, and the shocked man changed the price from 1,000,000 won to 5,000,000 won. The hero knew that the equipment created by the best student of the faculty was now attracting everyone's attention. In addition, it is an upgraded item whose rank has been raised from rare to epic. The audience understood that this was new material for research, so in the blink of an eye, they raised the price to 100 million. Jake Myers also decided to participate in the auction and offered a whopping 200 million. But Erica quickly outbid him, offering 210 million. The presenter only fueled their excitement, and soon the price for the sword rose to 310 million. Chris was horrified when he realized that this was the same high society that just throws money around. And then suddenly a woman entered the room, interrupting all the proposals at once, since she herself was ready to give 600 million. Jake realized with horror that he had failed to fulfill his sister's request to buy back the weapon at any cost. As it turned out, that woman was Dean Rebecca herself, who showed up like a whale at a shrimp fight. Both Jake and Erica were devastated because they couldn't beat that price. The presenter also froze in horror upon hearing such a huge sum. But in the end, he announced that the white light sword had been sold to Rebecca for 600 million. Professor Charles was more than pleased with this outcome of events. Soon the hero went to the dean's office, where he checked his bank account, which had already been replenished with 600 million. He happily confirmed to Rebecca that the entire amount had arrived on his card. Chris then asked how she planned to use the sword, and the girl said that she planned to go into a dangerous area and test it. She explained that she felt sorry to use such an object simply for training. Chris said he would like to try it out and asked if she had chosen a location, suggesting that she look at the Inval Mountains. Rebecca said that this place was chosen for the first internship for freshmen, but Chris still insisted. The dean still thought that this would be wrong, but then Chris offered to make any weapon for her in return. Without wasting a second, Rebecca grabbed the calendar, already preparing to set a convenient date for the hero. They eventually agreed to meet next week, but Chris knew it was really just an excuse. He thought of the conqueror of the peaks, Jürgen Kruger, chairman of the board of the leading plague corporation and the most powerful necromancer. One of the artifacts he lost after the attack of the Pandemonium demons is hidden on Mount Inval. Meanwhile, Jake returned with disappointing news to his sister. She realized that her brother had never been able to get that sword in the end. Jake asked her for forgiveness, but Arya said that it didn't matter anymore. They needed to think about what to do next. She remembered that she and Chris attended the same classes, Professor Kwansu's body control course. Arya asked to find a moment and ask Chris, and if he decides this matter, then she will talk to her father about the inheritance ceremony. However, she mentioned that at this rate, Jake would soon be displaced from his position as the top graduate. Arya was sure that her brother himself was well aware of this. She was about to continue, but Jake interrupted her and said that he understood everything. Whatever method he had to use, he promised that he would definitely get the sword from Chris. Arya laughed in response and told him that he shouldn't interrupt his Nuna when she was speaking, and the guy quickly apologized. Then the girl, smiling, asked to bring her this sword. She stressed that she must get it at any cost. Arya thought back to that incident in the arena when Chris said she irritated him. It seemed strange to her that this guy could achieve the point where she felt irritation towards him.